Forward some years ago, I began to study the Torah. As my facility with the text grew, I pursued the midrashic literature of the rabbis, and the interpretations of the classic medieval commentators. Eventually, I began to inquire about mystical commentaries on the Torah. I turned to the Zohar, seeking an English translation of its original Aramaic. I soon learned that previous translations not only were incomplete but also had been undertaken in the early 20th century. Therefore, they did not reflect the enormous advances in scholarship since made by Gershom Scholem and his students. It was at this point that I realized how much I wanted to be able to study the Zohar from an English translation that would draw upon the research and scholarship of the past half-century. I determined to sponsor such a translation. The book you hold in your hands is the result. By its nature and purpose, the Zohar is difficult to penetrate. For hundreds of years it was inaccessible to all but a few. Furthermore, after the Sabbatean episode of the 17th century, the Jewish community became concerned about the potency of mystical ideas. Leaders were anything but eager to promulgate the Zohar. Even with the rise of Hasidism as a mystically based movement starting in the 18th century, the Zohar remained a closed book. Consequently, bringing the Zohar to the English reading public was, and continues to be, a complex, challenging task. The words that can express my appreciation to Daniel C. Matt are found on every page of his translation of the Zohar. His scholarship, his artistry, and his poetry speak for themselves. You, the reader, are in his debt. The odyssey of the past 9 years, which will continue for some years to come, has been shepherded through a tangle of legal and administrative steps with the able and devoted skill of Glenn Miller. Professor Arthur Green, who co-chairs the academic committee for the translation of the Zohar, has been a thoughtful and faithful counselor from the inception of the project. My husband Tom, while not a student of the Zohar, recognized the magnitude and the importance of this project. He has kept us ever vigilant and focused with his insightful questions and thoughts and his constant support. Forward from conception through gestation and finally to birth, this project would not have been realized without the wisdom, knowledge, and nurturing of Rabbi Yehiel Putko. He is my teacher and my friend, and it is to him that this edition of the Zohar is dedicated. It is with a sense of fulfillment and awe for Daniel Matt's remarkable accomplishment that my family and I now present the Zohar to the English reading public, with the hope that the radiance that flows from this great work and from the Jewish mystical tradition will bring light to those who seek it. Margot Pritzker. Daniel C. Matt Sefer HaZohar, the Book of Radiance, has amazed and overwhelmed readers ever since it emerged mysteriously in medieval Spain Castile toward the end of the 13th century. Written mostly in a unique Aramaic, this masterpiece of Kabbalah exceeds the dimensions of a normal book. It is virtually a body of literature, comprising over 20 discrete sections. The bulk of the Zohar consists of a running commentary on the Torah, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. This translation begins and focuses there, in what are projected to be 10 volumes. 2 subsequent volumes will cover other, shorter sections. Arthur Green's introduction to this volume traces the development of Kabbalah and discusses the historical and literary context of the Zohar, its style, the complex question of authorship, and the symbolism of the 10 Sephirot, various aspects of the divine self. Here I wish to treat several topics directly related to this translation and commentary. Establishing the text of the Zohar. This edition reflects a newly constructed, precise text of the Zohar, based on original manuscripts. Why was the creation of such a text necessary? All previous translations of the Zohar are based on the standard printed editions, which nearly all derive from the Mantua edition, 1558 to 1560, supplemented by variant readings from the Cremona edition, 1559 to 1560. At first I intended to 1. The title derives from the word XM, Zohar, in Daniel 12:3. The enlightened will shine like the Zohar, radiance, or splendor, of the sky. 2. On the various sections of the Zohar, see Gershom Scholem, Kabbalah, 214:19, Isaiah Tishby, Wisdom of the Zohar, 1:17. All of these sections are written in Aramaic, except for Midrash Hanelim, which is written in Hebrew and Aramaic. The following sections are scheduled to be translated as part of the running commentary on the Torah, as in the standard editions of the Zohar: Raza Dir Azin, Sava Dimispadim, Sifra Dietzniuda, Idra Rabbah, Idra Zuda, Rav Mativta, and Yanuga. The 2 subsequent volumes will include Midrash Hanelim, Matnadan, Tosefta, Sitra-e Torah, Hekalit, Sitra-e Odiayat, Vision of Ezekiel, Kav Hamida, and Zohar to Song of Songs. 2 sections identified as imitations written by a later Kabbalist, Tikvna-e HaZohar and Ra'aya Mehimna, are not planned to be included. Follow the same procedure, but upon examining many of the original manuscripts of the Zohar dating from the 14th through 16th centuries, I discovered a significant number of superior readings that had been rejected or revised by editors of the first printed editions. Upon further examination, I noticed something more intriguing, a phenomenon familiar to scholars of medieval texts. Within the manuscripts themselves were signs of an editorial process, revision, reformulation, and emendation. After careful analysis, I concluded that certain manuscripts of older lineage reflect an earlier recension of the Zohar, which was then reworked in manuscripts of later lineage. I realized that I could no longer rely on the printed versions of the Zohar, since these obscured earlier versions, so I took it upon myself to reconstruct a new ancient version of the Aramaic text based on the manuscripts, one which could serve as the foundation for this translation. If I could have located a complete, reliable manuscript of the Zohar, this would have provided a starting point. Unfortunately, no such manuscript exists anywhere in the world. In all likelihood it never did, since from the start the Zohar was circulated in sections or booklets. Probably no single complete book of the Zohar existed until it was printed nearly 300 years later in the 16th century, collated from various manuscripts. Degrees 3. See Ernst Goldschmidt, Medieval Texts and Their First Appearance in Print, Malachi Guerrier, Transmission of Texts by Scribes and Copyists, Unconscious and Critical Interferences, Israel Tashma, The Open Book in Medieval Hebrew Literature, The Problem of Authorized Editions, Daniel Abrams, Introduction to Sefer HaBahir, edited by Idem, 8, 14, Idem, Critical and Post-Critical Textual Scholarship of Jewish Mystical Literature. 4. Among the manuscripts reflecting an earlier recension are the following: Cambridge, University Library, MS Ad 1023, Munich, Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, Cod, Heber 217, New York, Jewish Theological Seminary, MS 1761, Oxford, Bodleian Library, MS 1564, Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale, Heb. 779, Rome, Biblioteca Casanatense, MS 2971, Toronto, University of Toronto, MS Friedberg 5015, Vatican, Biblioteca Apostolica, EBR 206, 208. Manuscripts resembling, and perhaps underlying the Mantua edition include: London, British Museum, MS 762, Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale, Heb. 781, Parma, Paro 15/A, a list of 84 Zohar manuscripts assembled by a team working under Rivka Schatz-Offenheimer, was published by Zvi Rubin in Meifel HaZohar, Madarat Vehesajim, 172-73. Ronit Meroz of Tel Aviv University is conducting a systematic analysis of over 600 extant manuscripts and fragments of the Zohar. In her extensive research, she has identified numerous examples of editing and revision. While the discovery noted here of earlier and later recensions of the Zohar is my own, I have benefited from discussions with her and wish to thank her for sharing her insights with me. See her articles Zoharic Narratives and Their Adaptations and her other studies listed in the bibliography. For further information on the manuscripts of the Zohar, see Tishbe, Wisdom of the Zohar, 1, 99-101, Skalim, Kabbalah, 236-37, and the comments of Malachi Guerrier, cited by Tashma, Hanigla Shibanister, 103-4. 5. C. Abrams, Imate Hubaraha, Hakdam Ali Sefer HaZohar, Idem, Critical and Post-Critical Textual Scholarship of Jewish Mystical Literature, 61. This situation left me with two choices. I could select the best manuscript for each individual Torah portion of the Zohar and produce a diplomatic text, an exact reproduction of the original. Or, I could fashion a critical text, selecting from a wide range of variants in different manuscripts. After consulting with members of our academic committee for the translation of the Zohar, I chose to compose a critical text, based on a selection and evaluation of the manuscript readings. The primary reason was simply that even for individual sections of the Zohar there is no one best manuscript. Each has its own deficiencies and scribal errors. Back in the 16th century, the editors in Mantua and Cremona also fashioned critical texts, the former drawing on 10 manuscripts, the latter on 6 degrees for the first 2 volumes of the translation. I identified approximately 20 reliable manuscripts, based on the criteria of provenance, age, lack of scribal errors, and legibility. The originals are preserved in the libraries of Oxford, Cambridge, London, Paris, Munich, Rome, the Vatican, Parma, Toronto, and the Jewish Theological Seminary, while microfilm copies are available in the Institute for Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts, in the Jewish National and University Library on the campus of the Hebrew University, Jerusalem. It is appropriate to describe more fully the methodology used in this scholarly undertaking. My research assistant meticulously combs through about half of these manuscripts and prepares a list of variant readings. For particularly difficult words or phrases, we check additional manuscripts. In addition to the manuscripts, my assistant lists variants from the Mantua and Cremona editions of the Zohar, as well as the edition used by Moses Cordovero in his 16th century commentary, or Yager. My procedure for establishing the Aramaic text is as follows. I begin with Reuven Margaliot's edition of Sefer HaZohar, based on the Vilna edition, which in turn is based on the Mantua edition. This represents a relatively reliable starting point. In front of me I have the list of variants prepared by my research assistant, photocopies of the original manuscripts, and other witnesses referred to previously, registered. I peruse the variants line by line. Some of these are 6. See Tishbe, Wisdom of the Zohar, 1, 98. For an enlightening comparison of diplomatic and critical editing, see Chaim Milikowski, further on editing rabbinic texts, 7. See the list of Zohar manuscripts in the bibliography, and above. Note 4. Bound copies of nearly all of these manuscripts are housed in the Gershom Scholem Collection, Jewish National and University Library. 8. I also check readings in other sources including Menachem Recanati, Pirush al-HaTorah, Joseph Angelino, Livnat HaSapir, Abraham Galante, Inor HaHama, Shimon Lavi, Kedem Paz, Abraham Azulay, or HaLevina, Joseph Hamaz, ed. Derek Emmett, a list of emendations to the Mantua edition, Shalom Buzaglo, Migdash Melech, Yehuda Ashlag, Pirush HaSulam, and Gershom Scholem's annotated Zohar. See the bibliography 9. Sefer HaZohar, ed. Reuven Margaliot 10. See above. No date. Simply scribal errors or glosses, but some represent what appear to be better readings. When I identify an apparently better reading, I check if it is shared and confirmed by several reliable manuscripts and witnesses. If it is, I consider substituting it for the printed text. Over the centuries, Sefer HaZohar has been revised by countless scribes and editors who tried to smooth away the rough edges of the text by adding an explanatory phrase, correcting an apparent syntactical mistake, or taming a wild neologism by substituting a more familiar, bland term. Often, relying on the variants, I decide to remove these accumulated layers of revision, thereby restoring a more original text. I seek to recover the Zohar's primal texture and cryptic flavor. If the early manuscripts preserve unusual, striking wording that is revised or corrected by several later manuscripts and the printed editions, I tend to go with the older reading. Often, according to the more reliable manuscripts, a Zoharic rabbi creatively paraphrases a Talmudic saying. Some of the later manuscripts and the printed editions may then restore this saying to its exact Talmudic form. In such cases I amend the printed text in favor of the Zohar's original formulation, original in both senses, older and creative. In the commentary I cite the Talmudic saying on which the paraphrase is based, so that readers can see the transition and trace the imaginative process. I do not claim to be fully restoring the original text of the Zohar. There may never have been any such thing, since the text probably emerged over many years, written and distributed piecemeal. However, through painstaking analysis of the variants, I am able to scrape away some 700 years of accretion and corruption, and at least approach that elusive, hypothetical original. This Aramaic text of the Zohar, the basis of my translation, is available for study and scholarly examination. Translation and commentary. All translation is inherently inadequate, a well-intentioned betrayal. In the words of the 2nd century sage Rabbi Yehuda, one who translates a verse literally is a liar. One who adds to it is a blasphemer. ? Furthermore, the Zohar is notoriously obscure, perhaps the most difficult Jewish classic to translate. It was composed in Castile, mostly in Aramaic, a language no longer spoken in medieval Spain. The author concocted a unique blend of Aramaic out of traditional sources, especially the Babylonian Talmud and Targum Angelus, and Nun. At the website of Stanford University Press, www.sop.org/Zohar12, BD Kiddushin 49a13, on the Zohar's Aramaic, see Scholam, Kabbalah, 226-29, Tishbi, Wisdom of the Zohar, 1, 64-68. Aramaic translation of the Torah. This unparalleled Neo-Aramaic is peppered with enigmatic expressions, puns, outlandish constructions, puzzling neologisms, solecisms, and traces of medieval Hebrew and Castilian. The Zohar's prose is poetic, overflowing with multiple connotations, composed in such a way that you often cannot pin down the precise meaning of a phrase. The language befits the subject matter, which is mysterious, elusive, and ineffable. Words can merely suggest and hint. An unfathomable process may be stated, then immediately denied. It split and did not split its aura. Occasionally we encounter oxymorons, such as new ancient words, alluding to the dual nature of the Zohar secrets, recently composed yet ascribed to ancient sources. Degrees. The first impulse of divine emanation is described as XRY12 Su TPT, Botsina Digardinuda, a spark of impenetrable darkness, ! Registered sign so intensely bright that it cannot be seen. Through the centuries, the potency of the Zohar's language has mesmerized even those who could not plumb its secrets. While Kabbalists delved deeply, the uninitiated chanted the lyrical Aramaic, often unaware of its literal meaning. In the words of an 18th century mystic, even if one does not understand, the language is suited to the soul. No doubt it is risky to translate the Zohar, but it would be worse to leave these gems of wisdom buried in their ancient Aramaic vault. So I have plunged in, seeking to transmit some of the Zohar's magic. The previous English translation, composed in the 1930s by Harry Sperling, Maurice Simon, and Paul Leverdoff, reads smoothly but often misunderstands the text. Its genteel prose is more a paraphrase than an accurate translation, avoiding unfamiliar terms, censoring erotic material, skipping difficult passages and even entire sections. The English flows too fluently compared to the original, subduing the unruly Aramaic, failing to render its untamed vibrancy. Moreover, since the translation is unaccompanied by a commentary, the symbolism remains impenetrable. Despite its shortcomings, I have learned much from consulting this translation, along with others, but my approach is significantly different. Though I wish to make the Zohar accessible, I also want to convey its strangeness. 14. Zohar 115a. Citations of the Zohar refer to the standard Aramaic pagination, based on the Mantua edition of 1558 to 1560, which in the Zohar, Pritzker edition is indicated in the running head on each page. 15. See Daniel Matt, New Ancient Words, The Aura of Secrecy in the Zohar. 16. Zohar 115a 17. Moses Hayim Lazado, in his preface to Kelapitha Hakma, cited by Tishbi, Wisdom of the Zohar, 129. 18. This 5-volume edition is entitled The Zohar. See Bibliography. Scholam remarks, Kabbalah, 241, that it suffers from incomplete or erroneous understanding of many parts of the Kabbalistic exposition. 19. I have also consulted 4 different Hebrew translations, by Yehuda Ashlag, Daniel Frisch, Yehuda Edry, and Yechiel Bar-Lev. Charles Mopsik's French translation, La Zohar. Potency, and rich ambiguity. Here the commentary is essential. When the translation cannot adequately express a multifaceted phrase, I unfold the range of meaning in the commentary. When the translation is as cryptic as the original Aramaic, the commentary rescues the stranded reader. My style of translation is literal yet poetic. I am convinced that a literal rendering of the Zohar is not only the most accurate but also the most colorful and zestful, the best way to transmit the lyrical energy of the Aramaic. Still, at times, the multivalent language invites a certain freedom of expression. Let me cite 2 related examples. In Zohar 1:83a, Rabbi Shimon describes the nighttime journey of the soul, soaring skyward from her sleeping body, flying. She encounters those 77 v. Pip, Qumran Tehran, of defilement. What does this bizarre term mean? The Sperling-Simon translation renders it as certain bright but unclean essences. Degrees. The English translation of Tishbe's wisdom of the Zohar reads, the deceiving lights of uncleanness, while Tishbe's original Hebrew translation reads a bit differently. Mimi 77. Kimuri Negahut, roughly, vaulted splendors, though in his note he acknowledges that the meaning is doubtful. I render the sentence as follows. Flying, she encounters those hooded, hunchbacked, dazzling demons of defilement. The accompanying commentary explains that these are malevolent forces who block the ascent of an unworthy soul. Qumran derives via rabbinic usage from the Greek gamera, arched cover, while Tehiran is a cognate of the Aramaic tihara, meaning brightness. Noon. One class of demons is named Tehari, noonday demons. The virtuous soul who evades these demons reaches heaven and receives a divine message. According to another Zoharic passage, 1:130, while descending back to her sleeping earthbound body, the soul is assailed by ppv 777 AAN, Havila Terrigen. The Sperling-Simon translation renders this phrase as malignant bands. The English translation of Tishbe's wisdom of the Zohar reads, JLL intentioned destructive powers. I render it as ravaging bands of truku. Lent stingers. The commentary explains that Havila derives from either hevel, band, group, or the verb hvi, to injure, destroy. Terrigen derives from the root trq, to sting, bite. The Hebrew anthology by Fischel Lachauer and Isaiah Tishbe, Misnat HaZohar, and its English version, The Wisdom of the Zohar, trans. David Goldstein, and the recent English translation edited by Michael Berg, The Zohar by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yache, which, however, is based not on the original Aramaic but on Ashlag's Hebrew translation. For details on all of these, see the Bibliography 20, The Zohar, trans Harry Sperling and Maurice Simon, 1, 277, 21, Tishbe, Wisdom of the Zohar, trans. Goldstein, 2, 818, 22, Idem, Misnat HaZohar, 2, 134. He concludes by saying that the phrase may mean, delusive lights, 23, The Zohar, trans Sperling and Simon, 219. 24, Tishbe, Wisdom of the Zohar, trans Goldstein, 2, 813. Although the Zohar's basic vocabulary is limited, its roots generate a rich variety of meanings. For example, the root jn, tqn, spans the following range: establish, institute, mend, restore, correct, perfect, prepare, arrange, array, adorn. The root pv, slq, can mean rise, raise, culminate, attain, surpass, depart, disappear, die, remove, postpone, reserve, emit fragrance. In normal Aramaic and Hebrew, the specific verbal conjugation determines which meaning of the root applies, but the Zohar ignores or flouts rules of grammar, confusing the conjugations, playing with multiple meanings, often leaving the reader stumped and wondering. Mysticism strives to penetrate a realm beyond distinctions, but this mystical masterpiece demands constant decision-making, challenging the reader or translator to navigate between conflicting meanings and determine the appropriate one, or sometimes to discover how differing meanings pertain simultaneously. The frequent dilemmas of interpretation suggest that in exploring the Zohar, linguistic search and spiritual search go hand in hand. Especially puzzling, though charming, are the neologisms strewn throughout the Zohar, intended to bewilder and astound the reader. Some derive from rare Talmudic terms, which the author refashions by intentionally spelling or by inverting letters. Some derive from Greek, Latin, or Castilian. Some appear to be pure inventions. These nonce words often contain the letters D, Tet, 0, Samek, 5, Pe, Gof, and 1, Resh, in various combinations. XM5VI, Guspida, NVDVPP, Gatpira, KLUTP, Kurta, NTP, Jessira, Nigwadip, Gustara, Nod, Tufsara. Custera derives from the Latin word castrum plural, castra, fortress, castle. Catpira and its variations mean several things, including knot, based on Aramaic XP, kitra, and waterskin. Degrees 1 newly coined noun, X9PV, tigla, is particularly versatile. In various contexts it can mean scale, hollow of the hand, fist, potter's wheel, and water clock. This last sense refers to a device described in ancient and medieval scientific literature, which in the Zohar functions as an alarm clock, calibrated to wake Kabbalists precisely at midnight for the ritual study of Torah. A similar device was employed in Christian monasteries to rouse monks for their vigils. How appropriate to invent a word for an invention. Often, by pondering the context, comparing Zoharic and rabbinic parallels, and scouring sundry dictionaries and lexicons, one can decipher or at least conjecture the meaning of these weird terms, but some remain as perplexing as originally intended. 25. See Tishbe, Wisdom of the Zohar, 1, 66-67, 26. See Yehuda Leib's, Parajim Bimilan Sefer HaZohar, 349-54, 27. See Zohar 1, 92b in my commentary. 28. After wrestling with Zoharic neologisms for years, I no longer share Tishbe's view, Wisdom of the Zohar, 1, 66, that only rarely is it possible to determine their meaning from the context, while for the most part it is difficult even to guess what the author had in. In translating biblical citations, I have consulted various translations but generally composed my own. Sometimes, in quoting a verse, the Zohar intends a meaning different from that conveyed by any known translation. In such cases I usually translate the verse as the Zohar understands it and then explain the difference in the commentary. The main purpose of the commentary is to clarify the dense symbolism and unique terminology. Here I seek to elicit the meaning of the text, drawing it forth from the Zohar's own language without being heavy-handed, without ruining the subtlety and ambiguity of the original. Remember that the Zohar was not intended to be easily understood but rather to be deciphered. I want to allow and compel the reader to wrestle with the text. Over the centuries, the tendency has grown to overinterpret, with commentators often insisting on assigning Sephirotic significance to nearly every image and metaphor. I have resisted this tendency, while still identifying Sephirotic correspondences when they are called for. Often a phrase or passage implies more than one meaning. The reader is encouraged to ponder various possibilities. To clarify the context, I cite sources and parallels from the Bible, rabbinic literature, and the Zohar itself, with occasional references to secondary literature. The aim is not to overwhelm the reader by citing everything conceivable, but rather to provide what is needed to make sense of this enigmatic work of art. Degrees in composing the commentary. I have drawn on numerous traditional and modern Zohar commentaries, especially those of Moses Cordovero, Shimon Lavi, Hayim Vital, Abraham Galante, Shalom Buzaglo, Yehuda Ashlag, Charles Mopsic, and Daniel Frisch. Other valuable resources include the annotations of Reuven Margaliot, Nitzatzui Zohar, in his edition of the Zohar, Isaiah Tishbe's monumental Misnat HaZohar, The Wisdom of the Zohar, Gershom Scholam's annotated Zohar, and Yehuda Leib's eye-opening Parakim Bimilan Sefer HaZohar, sections of the Zohar lexicon. A glossary, bibliography, and an index of biblical and rabbinic citations are appended to each volume. A diagram of the 10 Sephirot appears on page I of Mind. Still, I can appreciate the confession of David Goldstein, translator of Wisdom of the Zohar, who, after rendering several obscure lines directly from the Aramaic, writes, Ibid. 106, and 16. The English translations given are purely hypothetical. 29. Translations I have consulted include the King James Version, New International Version, New Revised Standard Version, the JPS Hebrew English Tanakh, Everett Fox's The Five Books of Moses, and Richard Elliott Friedman's Commentary on the Torah with a New English Translation. 30. I have tried to follow the sage advice of Samuel Sandmel, who years ago warned scholars about the dangers of parallelomania. See his presidential address of that title delivered to the Society of Biblical Literature and Exegesis and published in Journal of Biblical Literature 81, 1962, 113. 31. See the bibliography. This volume, the standard Aramaic pagination of the Zohar, is indicated in the running head on each page. Cent G. 134b. How to read the Zohar. There is no single right way to read and proceed through the Zohar, but I can point out certain features and suggest several guidelines. First of all, the Zohar is dynamic, full of surprises. Typically we find that Rabbi Hiaiah and Rabbi Yos were walking on the way, wandering through the hills of Galilee, sharing secrets of Torah, but also moving from one dimension to another, accompanied by Shekinah, the divine presence herself. Who knows whom they will encounter on the road? A child amazes them with wisdom. A beggar enriches them with precious teachings. A cantankerous old donkey driver turns out to be a sage in disguise. You are about to enter an enchanted realm. Still, although the Zohar sometimes reads like a mystical novel, remember that this is fundamentally a biblical commentary. It's helpful to have a Bible at hand to check the original context, to see how a particular verse becomes a springboard for the imagination. Every few pages we read, Rabbi Hiaya opened, Rabbi Yosa opened, signifying that he is opening not only his exposition but also the verse, disclosing new layers of meaning, expanding the range of interpretation. The reader of the Zohar should be open, too, open to new ways of thinking and imagining. As the Havraya companions continually exclaim, "Come and see." The Zohar is firmly rooted in tradition but thrives on discovery. This verse has been discussed, but come and see. This verse has been established, but come and see. Innovations of Torah are required here. Innovation emerges through scrutinizing the biblical text, so questioning becomes a supreme value. After Rabbi Hizkiah asks Rabbi Abba a challenging question, we are told that Rabbi Abba came and kissed him. Why? Because, as one commentator notes here, the question is half the answer. Without a question, there is no reason for an answer. Degrees even when the meaning of a verse is perfectly clear, the Zohar may question its structure, sometimes probing so deeply that the reader is stunned. To take an extreme example, come and see how Rabbi Elazar deals with the concluding verse in the story of the Garden of Eden, which could hardly be more explicit. He drove out Adam. Degrees we do not know who divorced whom, if the blessed. 32. Zohar 156b, 112a, 136a, and frequently 33, Ibid, 155b 34, Ibid, 155a 35, Abraham Galante, in Or HaHama, at LOC, on questioning in the Zohar, see Matt, New Ancient Words, 198-99. 36. Genesis 3:24, literally, he drove out the human Holy One divorced Adam, or not, as the rabbi demonstrates by exegetically artifice. The mystical meaning is the shocking alternative lurking within that bland phrase, or not. Adam drove out, divorced Shekinah, splitting her from her divine partner, Tiferet, and from himself. Once, as Adam, humanity was wedded to God. The original sin lies in losing intimacy with the divine, thereby constricting unbounded awareness. This loss follows inevitably from tasting the fruit of discursive knowledge. It is the price we pay for maturity and culture. The spiritual challenge is to search for that lost treasure, without renouncing the self or the world. As you read, see how the Havraya coax new meaning out of a biblical verse, phrase, word, or even letter. Often, they rely on standard rabbinic techniques of interpretation, such as verbal analogy. Here is written, such and such a biblical expression, and there is written, an identical, or nearly identical expression, implying a close link between the two expressions. The hermeneutical leap may be long, far from the literal meaning, but sometimes the verses read hyperliterally, ignoring idiomatic usage in favor of a radically spiritual sense. For example, when God commands Abraham, 4:4, Lech Lecha, go forth, to the land that I will show you, Genesis 12:1, Rabbi Elazar insists on reading the words more literally than they were intended. Lech Lecha, go to yourself, search deep within to discover your true self. Another startling illustration is the Zohar's reading of the opening words of the Torah, traditionally rendered, in the beginning God created. Everyone assumes the verse describes the creation of the world, but for the Zohar it alludes to a more primal beginning, the emanation of the Sephirot from Fin Sof, infinity. How is this allusion discovered, or invented? By insisting on reading the Hebrew words in their precise order. D778 Nehemiah, Bereshit bara Elohim, construed now as with beginning, it created Elohim, that is, by means of Chokmah, the Sephirah of wisdom, known as beginning, it, ineffable Ein Sof, emanated Bina, the Sephirah of understanding, known by the divine name Elohim. God, it turns out, is the object of the verse, not the subject. The ultimate divine reality, Fin Sof, transcends and explodes our comfortable conception of God. The Zohar dares us to confront this reality, as it transforms the familiar story of creation into divine biography. So, as you undertake this adventure, expect to be surprised. Stay alert. The Zohar's teachings are profound and intense. One who hopes to enter and emerge in peace should be careful, persevering, simultaneously receptive and active. The message is not served to you on a platter. You must engage the text. 37. Zohar 153b 38. Ibid. 78a 39. Ibid. 15a. And join the search for meaning. Follow the words to what lies beyond and within. Open the gates of imagination. Above all, don't reduce everything you encounter in these pages to something you already know. Beware of trying to find the essence of a particular teaching. Although usually essence is the goal of mystical search, here essence is inadequate unless it stimulates you to explore ever deeper layers, to question your assumptions about tradition, God, and self. In the words of a Zoharic parable, there was a man who lived in the mountains. He knew nothing about those who lived in the city. He sowed wheat and ate the kernels raw. One day he entered the city. They offered him good bread. The man asked, "What's this for?" They replied, "It's bread, to eat." He ate, and it tasted very good. He asked, "What's it made of?" They answered, "Wheat." Later they offered him thick loaves kneaded with oil. He tasted them, and asked, "And what are these made of?" They answered, "Wheat." Later they offered him royal pastry kneaded with honey and oil. He asked, "And what are these made of?" They answered, "Wheat." He said, "Surely I am the master of all of these, since I eat the essence of all of these, wheat." Because of that view, he knew nothing of the delights of the world, which were lost on him. So it is with one who grasps the principle but is unaware of all those delectable delights diverging from that principle. Degrees 40. Zohar 2. 176a. B. The wheat and its products, kernels, bread, cake, and pastry, may symbolize 4 levels of meaning in Torah: simple, homiletical, allegorical, and mystical. See Mat. The Essential Kabbalah. 207. To thank all the people who have helped me begin to plumb the Zohar would burst this book's binding, so here I will briefly trace my path and acknowledge some of those who have helped me along the way. My father, of blessed memory, Rabbi Herschel Jonah Matt, taught me that God is real, and that by studying Torah you can experience Shekinah, the divine presence. I have sketched his life and assembled his writings in Walking Humbly with God. My mother, Gustine, has always been a fountain of love and a source of strength. I am grateful for her deep wisdom. I first ventured into Sefer HaZohar in 1970 during my junior year abroad at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The thick volumes were simultaneously forbidding and alluring. Deciphering the Aramaic text was a puzzle, a challenge, a quest. Soon I fell in love with the Zohar, captivated by its lush imagery and poetic magic. My teachers that year in Kabbalah included Joseph Dan, Ephraim Gottlieb, and Rivka Schatzoffenheimer, and a Kabbalist, Rav Toledano. I thank them all for guiding me into the orchard. From Jerusalem I returned to Brandeis University, where I completed my undergraduate degree and then, after some European travel, plunged into graduate study in Jewish mysticism with Alexander Altman, a superb Wissenschaft scholar and a gem of a man. He directed my doctoral dissertation, which consisted of a critical edition of the Book of Mirrors, a previously unpublished 14th-century Hebrew commentary on the Torah by David ben Judahi Hasid. I chose to edit this text because it included the first extended translations of the Zohar, from Aramaic to Hebrew. I was encouraged to undertake this project by Gershom Scholem, while serving as his teaching assistant in the fall of 1975. After I completed my dissertation, my friend Arthur Green invited me to compose an annotated translation of selections from the Zohar for the Paulist Press, as one volume in their Classics of Western Spirituality. Years earlier, Art had initiated me into the mystical thought of Hasidism, which stimulated me to uncover its roots in the Zohar. I am grateful for his insight and guidance over the years, and for demonstrating how to combine scholarship and spirituality. For 2 decades, I taught Jewish mysticism in Berkeley at the Graduate Theological Union GTU, a school where Jews, Christians, and Buddhists study side by side, stimulating one another. I learned much there from my colleagues and students. I want to thank, in particular, David Winston and David Bialy for their friendship and for the depth of their learning. I had been at the GTU for many years already when, one afternoon in September 1995, Art Green called me on the phone and told me about a woman from Chicago named Margot Pritzker. She had been studying the Zohar with Rabbi Yehiel Pupko, but the dated English translation they were reading had proved inadequate. Margot had decided to commission a new translation, said Art, and she was inviting me to undertake the task. I was astounded, and told my friend that I needed a few days to consider this. The days turned into weeks, which turned into months. As I kept wrestling with the thrilling, terrifying offer, I decided to translate a short section of the Zohar to see how it felt, but I poured myself into the experiment so intensely, day after day, that I was left drained, exhausted, discouraged. How could I keep this up for years and years? I reluctantly resolved to decline the offer, but Art convinced me to at least meet this woman and her rabbi. So the following May, the four of us gathered at the O'Hare Hyatt. I expressed my hesitation to them, and told Margot that the project could take 12 to 15 years, to which she responded, "You're not scaring me." I was won over by her genuine desire to penetrate the Zohar and make it accessible to English readers. A year or so later, over Independence Day weekend 1997, the Zohar project formally began with a 2-day conference outside Chicago attended by the leading academic scholars of Kabbalah. They were invited not just to participate in this conference but to constitute the academic committee for the translation of the Zohar, which was intended to guide and support this translation. The members of the committee are listed at the front of this volume. Over the past 6 years, I have benefited immensely from their feedback and encouragement. I thank all of them, especially Moshe Adel, Yehuda Leibs, Ronit Meraz, and Elliot Wolfson. Time and again, Yehuda generously shared insights drawn from his vast, intimate knowledge of the Zohar. I smile, recalling the many times we wrestled over the mystifying Aramaic, deepening our understanding of the text and our friendship. I spent the second year of the project, 1998 to 1999, at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem on a program entitled Studying the Zohar, directed by Yehuda Leibs. Here 7 fellows and 7 other visiting scholars, all 14 of us, members of the academic committee, engaged in research on various aspects of the text. Our weekly seminars were devoted to a close reading of Zohar passages, often those that I was currently translating. Here I presented a draft of my translation and benefited from the responses of my colleagues. I am grateful to all of them, as well as to the staff of the Institute, who provided an ideal setting for our research. When acknowledgements, the year-long program ended in June 1999. The Institute graciously allowed me to retain an office for the following year as well. In the summer of 2000, it was finally time to leave the tranquil environment of the Institute. Fortunately, Rabbi David Hartman provided me with an office at the Shalom Hartman Institute across town, where I spent the following 2 years, 2000 to 2002, in an atmosphere simultaneously peaceful and stimulating. David's enthusiasm for Torah energizes everyone around him, and I thank him for his support and encouragement, and for his healthy skepticism of mystical excess. I was enriched by my contact with many of the fellows at the Hartman Institute, especially Daniel Hartman, co-director, Daniel Abrams, Moshe Halbertal, Moshe Adel, Israel Null, Levi Lauer, Mena Kem Lorberbaum, Yair Lorberbaum, Israel Tashma, and Shlomo Ni. Shlomo was always generous in sharing with me his immense linguistic knowledge. As described in the translator's introduction, I have based my English rendering on a critical text of the Zohar, which I have constructed by drawing on variant readings from a wide range of manuscripts. I could not have accomplished this task without my indefatigable research assistant, Barry Mark, who spent more than 5 years painstakingly preparing lists of these variants for the first 2 volumes of the translation. I thank him immensely for his years of devotion to this task. Recently, Marav Carmeli has followed in his footsteps, proving herself a worthy successor, and I am indebted to her as well. Arthur Green has carefully read large portions of this translation and offered criticism and suggestions, for which I am truly grateful. As co-chair of the academic committee for the translation of the Zohar, he has helped guide the project from its birth. Numerous libraries offered valuable resources, especially the Gershom Scholem Collection and the Institute of Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts, both housed in the Jewish National and University Library, Jerusalem. I want to thank, in particular, Esther Leibs, head of the Scholem Collection, for her constant willingness to help, Benjamin Richler, director of the Institute of Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts, along with his staff, and Adam Virit for checking obscure references. Other libraries and collections that provided precious material include Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, Munich, Bibliotheca Apostolica, Vatican, Biblioteca Casanatanus, Rome, Biblioteca Palatina, Parma, Bibliothèque Nationale, Paris, the Bodleian Library, University of Oxford, the British Library, Cambridge University Library, the Flora Lamson Hewlett Library of the Graduate Theological Union, the Friedberg Collection, Univer. City of Toronto Library, the Günzburg Collection of the Russian State i.e. Moscow, and the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. The team at Stanford University Press, led by Jeffrey Byrne and Norris Pope, has been superb to work with and wondrously adept at generating the first, demanding volumes of this complex classic. In addition to Jeffrey and Norris, I want to thank Lowell Britson, Alan Harvey, Randy Hurst, David Jackson, Patricia Myers, and especially Mariana Rakov and Rob Ely. Rabbi David E. S. Stein's expert copy editing polished this book of radiance. As I toiled and exulted over the Zohar, I have received sound advice and warm encouragement from my far-flung siblings, Rabbi Jonathan Matt, Israel, David Matt, Iowa, and Debbie Erdfarb, New Jersey. My wife, Hannah, and I have been delving together into the Zohar ever since we met, discovering and sharing its new ancient meanings, gazing into each other's souls through its penetrating lens. Thank you for your compassionate wisdom and unfailing support. You bring to life the verse, on her tongue, a Torah of love, Proverbs 31 hours, and 26 minutes. You help me understand the words of Rabbi Elazar, Zohar 1, 141. Isaac embraced faith, seeing Shekinah dwelling in his wife. My angelic children, Michaela and Gabriel, have never lost their sense of wonder, and I thank them for arousing mine. May this translation touch you and open up new worlds. Rabbi Yehiel Putko, co-chair of the academic committee, has excited and inspired me ever since our first meeting 7 years ago. Descended from a famous Kabbalist, the Shelah, Isaiah Horowitz, he is intimately bound to the Zohar and has devoted himself to spreading its light. I thank him for conducting this project so deftly and passionately. Glenn Miller, Vice President of Zohar Education Project, Incorporated, has vitalized this adventure through his vision and devotion. On a practical level, he has navigated the arc of Zohar through countless legal and administrative passageways. I am profoundly grateful. Thomas J. Pritzker has generously supported and heartened all of us through this long process. I thank him deeply. And I wonder, is there a correlation between Tom's passion for exploring caves to discover ancient Asian art and the fact that, according to tradition, see below, page 76, the Zohar was composed in a cave? Margot, how can I express my gratitude to you? You have enabled me to devote myself to what I love. That is every scholar's dream. You have not only sponsored this immense project, you have participated, probing the translation and commentary, skillfully guiding the entire process. I hope that I have responded to your bold generosity by opening up the Zohar for you and for all those who, thanks to you, will be illumined by its rays. To you I dedicate this translation. Finally, to the one beyond all names, blessed are you for enlivening and sustaining me, and for bringing me to this moment. DCM. Arthur Greenpound's symbol. The Zohar is the great medieval Jewish compendium of mysticism, myth, and esoteric teaching. It may be considered the highest expression of Jewish literary imagination in the Middle Ages. Surely it is one of the most important bodies of religious text of all times and places. It is also a lush garden of sacred eros, filled to overflowing with luxurious plantings of love between master and disciples, among the mystical companions themselves, between the souls of Israel and Shekinah, God's lovely bride, but most of all between the male and female elements that together make up the Godhead, revered and canonized by generations of faithful devotees. The Zohar's secret universe serves as the basis of Kabbalistic faith, both within the boundaries of Judaism and beyond it, down to our own day, which has seen a significant revival of interest in Kabbalah and its teachings. The Zohar is a work of sacred fantasy. To say this about it is by no means to impugn the truth of its insights or the religious profundity of its teachings. The Middle Ages are filled with fantasy, angels and demons, heavenly principalities, chambers of heaven and rungs within the soul, secret treasures of the spirit that could be seen only by the elect, esoteric domains without end. All of these were to be found in the writings of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic authors throughout medieval times. All of them partake of fantasy. It may be said that all theological elaborations, insofar as they are allowed to become pictorial, are fantasy. They depict realities that have not been seen except by the inner eye of those who describe them, or by their sacred sources. In the case of Judaism, prohibitions derived from the second of the Ten Commandments forbade the depiction of such sacred realms in any medium other than that of words. Perhaps because of this, the literary imagination became extraordinarily rich. All those creative energies that might in other contexts have sought to reify sacred myth in painting, sculpture, manuscript illumination, or stained glass here had to focus on the word, especially on the timeless Jewish project of commentary and exegesis. In this sense, the Zohar may be seen as the greatest work of medieval Jewish iconography, one that exists only in the words of the written page, thence to be distilled in the imagination of its devoted students. Written in a lofty combination of Aramaic and Hebrew, the Zohar was first revealed to the world around the year 1300. Those who distributed it, orally and in small written fragments, claimed that it was an ancient text they had recently rediscovered, and that it had been composed in the circle of those described within its pages. Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei and his disciples, who lived in the land of Israel during the 2nd century of the Common Era. The obscurity of the Zohar's origins combined with its unique language and its rich poetic imagination to lend to the work an aura of unfathomable mystery. While a few of the more critical spirits in each century doubted the Zohar and questioned its authority, the great majority of readers, and later of Jewry as a whole, believed in the Zohar and venerated it, considering it a holy revelation and a sacred scripture that was to be ranked alongside the Bible and the Talmud as a divinely inspired source of religious truth. Only in modern times, and largely for apologetic reasons, was the Zohar deleted from the canon of what was considered mainstream Judaism. Translation of the Zohar into Western languages began as early as the 15th century, when passages were rendered into Latin for use by Christian devotees of esoteric lore in Renaissance Italy. In the 20th century, various translations of the Zohar, or at least of most sections of it, appeared in German, French, and English. The previous standard English translation is that of Harry Sperling and Maurice Simon, published in 1931 to 1934 by the Sonsino Press. The present translation and commentary by Daniel Matt reflect the high standards of Zohar scholarship that have been achieved in recent decades. These are the result of the new attention paid to Kabbalah in academic circles, largely thanks to the writings of Gershom Scholem, 1897 to 1982, and the cadre of scholars he and his successors have trained within the Israeli universities. The first to bring Scholem's approach to Kabbalistic studies to North American shores was Alexander Altman 1906 to 1987, at Brandeis University, whose students include both the translator of these volumes and the author of this introduction. Further discussion of the translation and the principles underlying it may be found in the translator's introduction. The purpose of this introduction is to equip the reader to better appreciate the Zohar text. The translation before you is one that takes full cognizance of the poetic spirit in which the Zohar was composed and especially of the elevated tone achieved by its unique use of language. To appreciate these in the fullest sense, it must be said, the Zohar needs to be read, indeed studied, in the original. Like most of the Kabbalistic tradition within which it stands, the Zohar is entranced with the mysteries of language, in both its oral and written forms. No translation could do justice to the Zohar's rich and creative appropriation of the nuances of Hebrew and Aramaic speech, its startling transformation of countless biblical verses, and the frequent subtle rereadings of the Talmudic Midrashic legacy that together comprise much of the Zohar's charm and genius. Nevertheless, a great deal can be gained through carefully reading and studying the Zohar in translation. For this to be possible, however, the reader needs to be initiated into the symbolic language in which the work was written. Although the Zohar's poesis often transcends the symbolic conventions, they are always present in the background of the writer's imagination. So too, it was assumed, would they be present in the mind of the reader. The Zohar was composed in the hope that it would be passed on and studied within circles of initiates, as indeed it was for many generations. To appreciate the Zohar, you will also need to know something of the historical and literary context in which it appeared. The Zohar made use of a very wide selection of Jewish texts that preceded it, ranging from the Torah itself to legal, mystical, and philosophical works that were written just shortly before its appearance. It reflected on all of these and used them freely as inspiration for its own unique sort of innovative and sometimes even playful religious creativity. It is also much concerned with the Jews and their history, that recorded in Scripture, the present exile, and the dream of messianic redemption. These, too, form part of the background needed to understand the Zohar. This introduction will begin by outlining the development of Kabbalah in the century leading up to the Zohar, considering also the use made in Kabbalah of prior Jewish sources. We will then turn to the Zohar itself, discussing in turn its style of thought and exegesis, its narrative modes, and the question of the Zohar's appearance and authorship. Because this essay serves as an introduction to the entire Zohar text, we will not quote passages to exemplify the analysis offered. We hope that the reader will proceed from this introduction to a careful reading of the text and commentary, finding ample passages throughout the Zohar against which to test the claims offered in this brief introductory essay. The tall order detailed in the preceding paragraphs requires a disclaimer. Monographs and learned articles have been written on each of the subjects just mentioned. Some of them have been the subject of entire books. This introduction does not seek to break new ground in most of them. It is rather a digest of what the writer considers to be the finest scholarship and deepest one. A much expanded version of this introduction to the Zohar is to be found in my Guide to the Zohar, also available from Stanford University Press. There the symbolic language of Kabbalah, i.e., the Sephirotic system, is more fully outlined and discussed. The most comprehensive introduction to the subject is the 3-volume Wisdom of the Zohar by Isaiah Tishby, originally written in Hebrew. The English translation by David Goldstein offers a thorough historical analysis of many topics covered by the Zohar, followed by selected passages. Although the Hebrew version was published in 1949 to 1961 and thus predates much of current Zohar scholarship, Tishby's work remains an invaluable source of knowledge. Insights regarding the Zohar that have been written since Scholem began the era of modern Kabbalah scholarship. While responsibility for any misunderstandings or omissions in this introduction are entirely my own, I wish to acknowledge fully that the insights contained within it are those of 3 or 4 generations of scholars who have labored hard as today's Mehatzedek Hakla, reapers in the field of Zohar scholarship. Many of these are members of the Academic Committee for the Translation of the Zohar, and their names are listed at the front of this volume. I am grateful to each of them for their contributions to our collective efforts to understand even a drop in the sea of the Zohar's profound secrets. 2. Jewish mysticism in the Middle Ages is a rereading of earlier Jewish tradition, including both the Bible and the corpus of rabbinic literature. It has to be understood in the context of the great project of medieval Jewry as a whole, the interpretation of a received, authoritative, and essentially complete body of normative Jewish teaching. This body of teaching, canonized in the Gaonic age, 8th–10th centuries, nominally commanded the loyalty of all Jewry, with the exception of a Karaite minority. But the deeper attachment of Jews to this tradition had to be rewon constantly, especially in the face of both Christian and Muslim polemics against Judaism, ever the religious culture of a minority living in the shadow of one or the other of its giant offspring. Increasingly, various new intellectual currents that came into fashion among the Jews also occasioned a need for defense or reinterpretation of the tradition. These included Mutazilite philosophy, Neoplatonism, and Aristotelianism. The classic form for such reinterpretation of authoritative texts was the commentary, whether on one or more books of the Bible or on a part of the Talmudic legacy. Kabbalah, a new sort of mystical esoteric exegesis first appearing in the 12th century, may be seen as another medieval rereading of the received Jewish canon. In order to understand the ways in which Kabbalah, and particularly the Zohar, finds its home within the earlier tradition, we need to distinguish 5 elements that are present in the legacy that medieval Jews had received from the Judaism of late antiquity or the Talmudic age. Although these 5 are not at all equal either in the amount of text devoted to them or in the degree of formal authority with which they are accredited, each was to play an important role in the new configuration of Judaism that Kabbalah represents. First of the 5 is Agadah, the narrative tradition, contained in the Talmud and the various works of Midrash. Midrash is a hermeneutical term, renderable both as inquiry and homiletics, indicating a way of delving into scripture that tended toward fanciful and extended rereadings. Much of Agadah is legendary in content, expanding biblical history and recreating the biblical landscape in the setting of the rabbinic world. But Agadah also includes tales of the rabbis themselves and teachings of wisdom in many forms, maxims, parables, folk traditions, and so forth. The Kabbalists made great use of the Midrashic Agadic tradition, drawing on both its methods of interpretation and its contents. The hermeneutical assumptions of Midrash, including the legitimacy of juxtaposing verses from anywhere within Scripture without concern for dating or context, the rearranging of words or even occasional substitution of letters, use of numerology and abbreviation as ways to derive meaning, the endless glorification of biblical heroes and the tarring of villains, all of these and others were carried over from Midrash into Kabbalah. Indeed, many of them were used by other sorts of medieval preachers as well, but the content of the Agadic worldview, with its mythic picture of God as creator and divine ruler who sees everywhere, who acts in history, who responds to prayer and human virtue, even suspending the laws of nature to rescue his beloved, who mourns with Israel the destruction of their shared temple and suffers with them the pain of exile. All this too was faithfully carried over into the Kabbalistic imagination. In fact, the Kabbalists were partial to the most highly anthropomorphic and mythic versions of rabbinic tradition, such as were contained in the 8th century collection Perjei Dir Rabbi Eliezer. Here they stood in sharp contrast to the prior emerging intellectual trend of the Middle Ages, Jewish philosophy, which exercised a degree of critical skepticism with regard to the more fantastic claims of the Agadah and sought out, whenever possible, those more modest and somewhat naturalistic viewpoints that could be found among certain of the early rabbis. Second is the tradition of Halakha, the legal and normative body of Talmudic teaching, the chief subject of study for Jews throughout the era, and thus the main curriculum upon which most Kabbalists themselves were educated. The early Kabbalists lived fully within the bounds of Halakha and created a meaning system that justified its existence, while later Kabbalah, beginning in the early 14th century, contains some elements that are quite critical of Halakha. Little of this trend is evident in the period before the Zohar. Some transmitters of Kabbalah, Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, see below, is the great example, were also active in the realm of halakhic creativity, writing responsa and commentaries on Talmudic tractates. More common was a certain intellectual specialization, undoubtedly reflecting spiritual temperament, spawning Kabbalists who lived faithfully within Halakha and whose writings show its patterning of their lives, but who devoted their literary efforts chiefly to the realm of mystical exegesis, including Kabbalistic comments on the commandments or reflection on aspects of halakhic practice. A third element of the rabbinic legacy is the liturgical tradition. While liturgical praxis was codified within Halakha and thus in some ways as a subset of it, the texts recited in worship, including a large corpus of liturgical poetry, or piayot, constitute a literary genre of their own. Medieval writers, including the mystics of both Spain and Ashkenaz, were much concerned with establishing the precise proper wording of each prayer. The text of the prayer book had been mostly fixed by compendia dating from the 10th century. In the Middle Ages, however, it became the object of commentaries, many of which sought to find their authors' own theologies reflected in these venerated and widely known texts by the ancient rabbis. This is especially true of the Kabbalists, who devoted much attention to the kavanah, or inward meaning, of liturgical prayer. The fourth strand of earlier tradition is that of Merkava mysticism. Merkava designates a form of visionary mystical praxis that reaches back into the Hellenistic era but was still alive as late as 10th century Babylonia. Its roots lie close to apocalyptic literature, except that here the voyager taken up into the heavens is usually offered a private encounter with the divine glory, one that does not involve metahistorical predications. Those who went down into the Merkava sought visions that took them before the throne of God, allowing them to travel through the divine palaces, Hekalit, realms replete with angels and, at the height of ecstasy, to participate in or even lead the angelic chorus. The term Merkava chariot links this tradition to the opening vision of the prophet Ezekiel, which was seen as the great paradigm for all such visionary experiences and accounts. It is also connected to the Kedusha formula, holy, holy, holy is YHVH of hosts, the whole earth is filled with his glory, of Isaiah 6. Since it is this refrain that most Merkava voyagers recount hearing the angels sing as they stand with them in the heavenly heights. The Merkava tradition was known to the medievals in two ways. Treatises by those who had practiced this form of mysticism, often preserved in fragmentary and inchoate form, were copied and brought from the Near East to Western Europe, as we shall see below. But just as important were the references to Merkava practice in the Talmudic literature itself, a fact that lent legitimacy to the fascination that latter-day mystics clearly felt for this material. Such great Talmudic sages as Rabbi Akiva and Rabban Yohanan son of Zakkai were associated with Merkava traditions. Akiva, considered in some Aggadic sources to be a sort of second Moses, is the subject of the most famous of all rabbinic accounts of such mystical voyages. He alone, unlike the other three of the four who entered the orchard, was able to enter in peace and leave in peace. While some modern scholars question the historicity of associating the early rabbinic sages with Merkava praxis, in the Middle Ages, the Talmudic sources were quite sufficient to sustain this link. It was the philosophic questioners of the Merkava traditions, rather than their mystical supporters, who were hard-pressed to defend their views. Merkava traditions also had considerable influence on the rabbinic liturgy, and this association too raised their esteem in medieval eyes. The fifth and final element of this ancient legacy is the hardest to define, partly because it hangs on the thread of a slim body of text, but also because it contains elements that seem contradictory to one another. I refer to the speculative magical tradition that reached medieval Jewry through the little book called Sefer Yetzirah and various other small texts, mostly magical in content, that are associated with it. Sefer Yetzirah has been shown to be a very ancient work, close in spirit to aspects of Greek esotericism that flourished in the late Hellenistic era. While the practice associated with this school of thought is magical theurgic, even including the attempt to make a golem, its chief text contains the most abstract worldview to be found within the legacy of ancient Judaism. By contemplating the core meaning of both numbers and letters, it reaches toward a notion of cosmic unity that underlies diversity, of an abstract deity that serves as cosmic center, in whom, or perhaps better, in which, all being is rooted. The magical praxis is thus a form of imitatio Dei, man's attempt to reignite the creative spark by which the universe has emerged from within the Godhead. Here we have the roots of a theology more abstract than anything to be found in the Aggadah or the Merkava tradition, an essentially speculative and non-visual mysticism. Sefer Yetzirah was the subject of a wide variety of commentaries in the Middle Ages, rationalists as well as mystics claiming it as their own. In the 12th century, the language and style of thought found in this work became central to the first generations of Kabbalistic writing, as reflected by commentaries on it and by the penetration of its terminology into other works as well. Kabbalah must be seen as a dynamic mix of these five elements, sometimes with one dominating, sometimes adding the mix of another. It was especially the first and last listed, the Aggadic mythic element and the abstract speculative magical tradition that seemed to vie for the leading role in forging the emerging Kabbalistic way of thought. Jewish esoteric traditions began to reach the small and isolated communities of Western Europe, some of which dated back to Roman times, perhaps as early as the 9th or 10th century. How these ancient materials first came to Franco-German Jewry is lost in legend, but it is clear from manuscript evidence that much of the old Merkava and magical literature was preserved among the earliest Ashkenazic Jews, along with their devotion to both Halakha and Aggadah. These esoteric sources were studied especially by groups in the Rhineland, who added to them their own speculations on God, the cosmos, and the secrets of the Torah. Out of these circles there emerged in the late 12th and early 13th centuries a movement known to history as Hasidut Ashkenaz, a pietistic revivalism based on small communities or brotherhoods of mystics who committed themselves to high standards of ascetic practice and contemplative devotion. These groups also played a key role in the preservation and further development of esoteric traditions. It was in the area of southern France called Provence, culturally akin in the High Middle Ages to northern Spain, that a somewhat different sort of esoteric speculations began to emerge. These came to be called by the name Kabbalah, a term applied to this emerging school of mystical thought in the early 13th century. The word means tradition. Its use in this context indicates that the Kabbalists saw themselves as a conservative element within the Jewish religious community. Their secrets, so they claimed, were Kabbalah, esoteric teachings received from ancient masters by means of faithful oral transmission from one generation to the next. The Provençal Jewish community in the 12th century was one of great cultural wealth, forming something of a bridge between the spiritual legacy of Jewish creativity in Spain of Muslim times and the rather separate world of Jewry in the Ashkenazic or Franco-Rhenish area. It is in this cultural realm that Kabbalah first appears, about the middle of the 12th century. The origins of this spiritual and literary movement are obscure and still much debated. There are clearly elements of Near Eastern origin in the earliest Kabbalah, materials related to Merkava and late Midrashic texts that were present in the Holy Land in the 9th or 10th centuries. There are also strong influences of elements that were to appear in Rhineland Hasidism as well, indicating that at some early point these two movements had a common origin. But here in Provence, a new sort of religious discourse began to emerge in circles of mystics who combined knowledge of these various traditions. These groups, which may have been several generations in formation, are known to us as the editors of one of the strangest and most fascinating documents in the long history of Hebrew literature. This slim volume is known as Sefer HaBahir, awkwardly renderable as the Book of Clarity. We first find reference to it in Provençal works of the latter 12th century, and from that time forward it has a continuous history as a major shaper of Jewish mystical ideas. The Bahir takes the form of ancient rabbinic midrash, expounding on biblical phrases, tying one verse of scripture to another, and constructing units of its own thought around what it offers as scriptural exegesis. Like the old midrash, it makes frequent use of parables, showing special fondness for those involving kings and their courts, in which God is repeatedly compared to a king of flesh and blood. In form, then, the Bahir is quite traditional. But as soon as the reader opens its pages to look at the content, astonishment takes over. The text simply does not work as midrash. Questions are asked and not answered, or answered in a way that only adds mystification. Images are proposed that in the midrashic context surely refer to God, and then suddenly things are said that make such a reading theologically impossible. The king turns out to have an older brother, for example. What sort of questions are these, and what sort of answers? The scholar is sometimes tempted to amend the text. If one comes to the Bahir, on the other hand, bearing some familiarity with the methods of mystical teachers, particularly in the Orient, the text may seem less bizarre. Despite its title, the purpose of the book is precisely to mystify rather than to make anything clear in the ordinary sense. Here the way to clarity is to discover the mysterious. The reader is being taught to recognize how much there is that he doesn't know, how filled scripture is with seemingly impenetrable secrets. You think you know the meaning of this verse, says the Bahir to its reader. Here is an interpretation that will throw you on your ear and show you that you understand nothing of it at all. Everything in the Torah, be it a tale of Abraham, a poetic verse, or an obscure point of law, hints at a reality beyond that which you can obtain by the ordinary dialectics of either Talmudic or philosophical thinking. As we read on in the Bahir, it becomes clear that the authors are not simply advocating obscurantism for its own sake. The text has in mind a notion, often expressed only vaguely, of a world that lies behind the many hints and mysteries of the scriptural word. To say it briefly, the Bahir and all Kabbalists that follow it claim that the true subject of scripture is God himself, that revelation is essentially an act of divine self-disclosure. Because most people would not be able to bear the great light that comes with knowing God, the Torah reveals divinity in secret form. Scripture is strewn with hints as to the true nature of that which is above and the mysterious process within divinity that led to the creation of this world. Only in the exoteric, public sense is revelation primarily a matter of divine will, teaching the commandments Israel is to follow in order to live the good life. The inner, esoteric revelation is rather one of divine truth, a web of secrets pointing to the innermost nature of God's own self. That self is disclosed in the garb of a newly emergent symbolic language, one describing the inner life of the deity around a series of image clusters that will come to be called, in a term derived from Sefer Yetzirah, the 10 Sephirot. The earliest documentary evidence of Kabbalah is found in two very different sorts of literary sources. The Bahir constitutes one of these. Alongside it there is a more theoretical or abstract series of Kabbalistic writings. These appear first in the family and close circle of Rabbi Abraham ben David of Pasquiers, a well-known Provençal Talmudic authority. His son, Rabbi Isaac the Blind, d. ca. 1235, and others linked to his study circle including family members, evidence an ongoing tradition of Kabbalistic praxis both in their brief commentaries on prayer and on Sefer Yetzirah, and in their written reflections on names of God. These treatises, quite laconic in style when compared with the mythic lushness of the Bahir, point to an already well-defined system of Kabbalistic contemplation, suggesting that their appearance after 1150 may reflect a decision to reveal in writing that which had been previously kept secret, rather than an entirely new genre of religious creativity. The sort of rabbinic circles in which Kabbalah is first found are highly conservative. It is hard to imagine them inventing this new sort of religious language on their own. It seems more likely that they saw themselves as guardians and transmitters of a secret tradition, passed down to them from sources unknown, but in their eyes surely ancient. The context for the publication of Kabbalistic secrets is the great spiritual turmoil that divided Provençal Jewry in the second half of the 12th century, the controversy over philosophy, and especially over the works of Rabbi Moses Maimonides, 1135–1204. This conflict came to a head with the public burning of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, by the Dominicans, but possibly with the tacit approval of anti-Maimonidean Jews, in 1232. The surrounding struggle engaged the intellectual life of the Provençal Jewish elite for several decades. As the era's great halakhic authority and codifier of Jewish law, Maimonides' name commanded tremendous respect. In many writings of the age, he is simply referred to as the rabbi, but his works raised not a few questions regarding his degree of theological orthodoxy. Did Maimonides go too far in his insistence that the Bible's ascription of emotions to God, as well as bodily attributes, was a form of anthropomorphism that needed to be explained away? Was it right that he derived so much of his wisdom from non-Jewish sources, the Greek and Islamic philosophical traditions? Was he correct in identifying the ancient rabbinic references to the account of the chariot and the account of creation with metaphysics and physics as the philosophers taught them? Did he have a right to dismiss certain old Jewish esoteric speculations as inauthentic nonsense? Still more painful in this law-centered culture, how could the rabbi have given legal status to his own Aristotelian philosophic views, seemingly insisting, in the opening section of his code, that any Jew who did not share them was either an idolater or a naive fool? But the heart of the Maimonidean controversy went deeper than all of these accusations, touching the very heart of the philosophical notion of the God head. Philosophy insisted on divine perfection, on the unchanging, all-knowing, all-capable quality of God. If perfect and unchanging, this God was necessarily self-sufficient and in no need of human actions of any sort. Why, then, would such a God care about performance of the commandments? How could a Torah centered on religious law, including so much of ritual performance, represent the embodiment of divine will? Maimonides taught that indeed God had no need for us to fulfill the commandments. The chief purpose of religious observance was educational, a God-given way of cultivating the mind to turn toward God. But once the lesson had been learned, some suspected, there would be those who would come to see the form itself as no longer needed. Moreover, it was rumored that in some circles of wealthy Jewry in Muslim Spain, the abstractions of philosophy had begun to serve as an excuse for a more lax view of the commandments and the details of their observance. Some rabbis of Provence were deeply loyal to a more literalist reading of the Talmudic and Midrashic legacy, one that left little room for the radical rationalization of Judaism proposed by the philosophers. Others had been exposed to the esoteric traditions of the Rhineland and northern France, which stood in conflict with the new philosophy partly because they seemed to highlight, rather than minimize, the anthropomorphic passages in scripture and tradition. The Franco-Rhenish tradition also had room for a strong magical component to religion. Ancient speculations on secret names of God and the angels still held currency in these circles. The power of using such names to affect the divine will, utter blasphemy in the eyes of the Maimonidean, was taken for granted in early Ashkenaz, as it had been centuries earlier throughout the Jewish world. The secrets of Kabbalah were made public in this age as a way to combat the influence of Maimonidean rationalism. The freedom and implied disinterest in human affairs of the philosophers' God frightened the mystics into coming out of the deep esotericism that had until then restricted them to oral transmission of their teachings within closed conventicles of initiates. Their secrets were to serve as an alternative explanation of the Torah, one that saw Torah and its commandments not only as playing a vital role in the ongoing spiritual life of Israel, but also as having a cosmos-sustaining role in a view of the universe that made them absolutely essential. It is no accident that two of the key subjects discussed in these earliest Kabbalistic speculations are the Kavanot, or secret meanings of prayer, and Tamei HaMitzvot, the reasons for the commandments. Both of these are interpreted in a way that insists on the cosmic effects of human actions. The special concentration on divine names played an essential part in early Kabbalah, setting in course a theme that was to be developed over many centuries of Kabbalistic praxis. The secret doctrines first taught in Provence were carried across the Pyrenees in the early 13th century, inspiring small circles of mystics in the adjacent district of Catalonia. One key center of this activity was the city of Girona, well known as the home of two of the most important rabbinic figures of the age, Rabbi Moses ben Naaman, called Naamanides, and Rabbi Jonah Gerandi, ca. 1200 to 1263. Naamanides, perhaps the most widely respected Jewish intellectual figure of the 13th century, is the most important personage associated with the early dissemination of Kabbalistic secrets. He was a leading Talmudic commentator, scriptural interpreter, and legal authority. His Torah commentary includes numerous passages, most brief and intentionally obscure, but several lengthy and highly developed, where he speaks in the way of truth, referring to secret Kabbalistic traditions. Alongside Naamanides there emerged a somewhat separate circle of Kabbalists including two very important teachers, Rabbi Ezra ben Solomon and Rabbi Azriel. These figures seem to have been more innovative than Naamanides in their Kabbalistic exegesis and also more open to the Neoplatonic philosophy of Abraham ibn Ezra and others that was gaining credence in their day. Naamanides was essentially conservative in his Kabbalistic readings, insisting that he was only passing down what he had received from his teachers, and his view of philosophical thought in general was quite negative. Rabbi Ezra, the author of commentaries on the Song of Songs and some Talmudic Aggadot, and his disciple Rabbi Azriel, who wrote a larger treatise on the Aggadot as well as a widely quoted commentary on the liturgy, combined the legacy of the Bahir with teachings received from Rabbi Isaac the Blind and his nephew Rabbi Asher ben David. They read Kabbalah in a Neoplatonic spirit, which is to say that they saw the Sephirot as an ordered series of emanations, increasingly removed from an unknowable primal source. This Catalonian Kabbalistic tradition remained fairly close to the original purpose we have suggested for the publication of Kabbalistic secrets. Naamanides' inclusion of openly Kabbalistic references in his highly popular Torah commentary complemented his fierce polemical attacks in that same work on Maimonides' philosophical interpretation of the Torah. Jacob bar Sheshet, another key Girona figure, also engaged in the battle against the rationalists. While neither Rabbi Azriel nor Rabbi Ezra of Girona is known to have written anything outside the realm of Kabbalah, their writings reflect significant rabbinic learning and show them to belong to the same traditionalist and anti-Aristotelian circles. Neoplatonism, they found, was a philosophy more amenable to the needs of mystics, thus rediscovering in a Jewish context something that Christian mystics had come to know many centuries earlier. Around the middle of the 13th century, a new center of Kabbalistic activity became active in Castile, to the west of Catalonia. Soon the writings of this new group, out of which the Zohar was to emerge, overshadowed those of the earlier Catalonian circle with regard to both volume and originality of output. The Castilian Kabbalists' writings were not characterized by the highly conservative rabbinic attitude that had been lent to Kabbalah by such figures as Rabbi Isaac the Blind and Naamanides. This circle had its roots more planted in the Bahir tradition than in that of the abstract language of early Provengal Catalonian Kabbalah. Mythic imagery was richly developed in the writings of such figures as the brothers Rabbi Isaac and Rabbi Jacob HaKohen and their disciple Rabbi Moses of Burgos. Their writings show a special fascination with the left side of the divine emanation and the world of the demonic. Rabbi Isaac HaKohen developed a full-blown mythos in which the forces of evil were presented as near-autonomous powers emanated in an act of purgation from the depths of divinity. Dependent upon both the divine and the human for their existence, they exist at the liminal outskirts of the Sephirotic realm and the phenomenal universe, at the very borders of chaos and non-being. There they wait in ambush for the Shekinah and the worlds that she creates and nurtures. Thus, to the world picture of divine Sephirotic hierarchy and an emanated cosmos, the Castilians add a parallel but antithetical realm of the demonic, serving as the source of all that is destructive in the cosmos. This conception of the left-hand emanation is founded on a set of suggestive Aggadic statements and biblical verses. In particular, the Castilian Kabbalists' imagination was sparked by Rabbi Abahu's famous dictum, "The Blessed Holy One created and destroyed worlds before he created these, saying, 'These please me. Those did not please me.'" Out of this and other fragments of Aggadic thought, Rabbi Isaac spun an elaborate mythos in which the Sephira Bina, at the dawn of time, welled forth emanations of pure din, literally judgment, but resulting in absolute forces of destruction, whose intensity doomed them to almost immediate annihilation. From the residue of these destructive forces rose a hierarchy of powers of unmitigated judgment, possessing no creative potency of their own. These forces are ontologically dependent upon divinity and are energized by the power released by human transgression. Because of their fascination with myths of the demonic realm, this group was characterized by Gershom Scholem as the Gnostic circle of Castilian Kabbalists. Their writings had great influence in the further development of Kabbalistic thought. They are the most immediate predecessors of the circle of Kabbalists represented in the Zohar. The mythic imagination of the Zohar, reaching to its greatest heights in depicting the realms of evil, has its roots in this setting. It is likely that Rabbi Moses de Leon, the central figure in both the writing and the circulation of the Zohar, saw himself as a disciple of these Gnostic Kabbalists. Rabbi Tadras Abulafia, a Kabbalist who also served as an important political leader of Castilian Jewry, is another important link between these two groups. Although significant in their own day, the writings of the Gnostic circle were mostly forgotten by later generations of Kabbalists and were not printed until Scholem himself retrieved them from rare surviving manuscripts. There is another difference between Catalonian and Castilian circles that is especially important for understanding the Zohar's place in the history of Kabbalah. The earliest Kabbalists were fascinated with the origin of the Sephirotic world, devoting much of their speculation to the highest Sephirot and their relationship to that which lies beyond them. They were also deeply committed to the full unity of the Sephirotic world, even to its circularity, so that the rising of all the Sephirot to be united with the highest one was a frequently articulated goal of contemplation. Varied patterns of interconnection in the upper worlds were reflected in the Kavanot, mystical directions, of prayers and in understandings of ritual commandments. But the ultimate goal of all of these was the full restoration of the divine unity and the rise of all to the highest rung, designated as Mahashava or Haskell, contemplation, intellect. The situation was quite different in the Castilian writings. Here the emphasis was placed on the lower part of the Sephirotic world, especially on the relationships between right and left and male and female. The counterbalancing of demonic energies needed the strengthening of the right hand power of divine love, and this could be awakened by human love of God and performance of the commandments. But as these writings developed, it was fascination with the sexual mysteries, reflected in the joining together of divine male and female, that overwhelmed all other symbolic interests. The uniting of the male 6th 9th Sephirot with the female 10th became the chief and in some places almost unique object of concern and way of explaining the religious life as a whole. This mysterium conjunctionis or Zavuga Kaddish lies at the very heart of Zoharic teaching. In the divergence between these two tendencies within Kabbalah, we see mythic and abstractionist elements struggling within the emerging self-articulation of the mystical spirit. In raising all to the very heights of the Sephirotic world, the Catalonians were voting for abstraction, a Kabbalah that led the mystic to experience a God not entirely removed from the rarefied transperson. Al-deity of the Jewish philosophers. The Castilians may have incorporated some aspects of Girona's Neoplatonism, but their spirit is entirely different, perhaps influenced in part by renewed contact with more mythically oriented Ashkenazic elements, and in part reflecting also the romantic troubadour ethos of the surrounding culture. They write in a spirit far from that of philosophy. Here we find a strong emphasis on the theurgic, quasi-magical effect of Kabbalistic activity on the inner state of the Godhead, and its efficacy in bringing about divine unity and thus showering divine blessing upon the lower world. Their depictions of the upper universe are highly colorful, sometimes even earthy. The fascination with both the demonic and the sexual that characterizes their work lent to Kabbalah a dangerous and close to forbidden edge that undoubtedly served to make it more attractive, both in its own day and throughout later generations. The last quarter of the 13th century was a period of great creative expansion among the Kabbalists of Castile. The Sephirotic Kabbalah, as detailed in the works of such well-known figures as Moses de Leon, Tadras Abulafia, Joseph Jacatilla, Isaac ibn Sayula, Joseph ben Shalom Ashkenazi, Joseph Angelino, and Joseph of Hamadan, all dating from the period between 1280 and 1310, constitutes a considerable and highly varied body of writing, even leaving aside the Zohar itself. It was within this circle that fragments of a more poetic composition, written mostly in lofty and mysterious Aramaic rather than Hebrew, first began to circulate. These fragments, composed within 1 or 2 generations but edited over the course of the following century and a half, are known to the world as the Zohar. 2. The emergence of Kabbalistic teaching is more complex and obscure than has been described in the preceding paragraphs. The relationship between Kabbalah and certain late forms of Midrashic writing is still not entirely clear. The nature and degree of contact between early Kabbalists and the German Hasidic circles, especially as reflected in the writings of Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, ca. 1165, ca. 1230, continues to puzzle scholars. The group of abstract mystical writings known as Sifrei Ha'ayin, or books of contemplation, fits somewhere into this puzzle, but its precise date and relationship to other parts of the pre-Zoharic corpus is still debated by scholars. The sources of the highly distinctive school of prophetic or ecstatic Kabbalah taught by Rabbi Abraham Abulafia, 1240 after 1292, while having little connection to the Zohar, also would require treatment in a full picture of the emergence of Kabbalistic thought. But this very brief treatment of major schools and themes should suffice to set forth the context out of which the Zohar emerged. 2. Kabbalah represents a radical departure from any previously known version of Judaism, especially in the realm of theology. While Kabbalists remained loyal followers of normative Jewish praxis as defined by Halakha, the theological meaning system that underlay their Judaism was reconstructed. The God of the Kabbalists is not primarily the powerful, passionate leader and lover of his people found in the Hebrew Bible, not the wise judge and loving father of the rabbinic Agadah, nor the enthroned king of Merkava visionaries. The Kabbalists' God also differ sharply from the increasingly abstract notions of the deity created by Jewish philosophers in the Middle Ages, beginning in the 10th century with Saadia Gaon and culminating in the 12th with Maimonides, whose work often stands in the background as the object of Kabbalistic polemics. The image of God that first appears in Sefer HaBahir, to be elaborated by several generations of Kabbalists until it achieved its highest poetic expression in the Zohar, is a God of multiple mythic potencies. Obscure entities eluding precise definition but described through a remarkable web of images, parables, and scriptural allusions. Together these entities constitute the divine realm. God is the collective aggregate of these potencies and their inner relationship. The dynamic interplay among these forces is the essential myth of Kabbalah, the true inner meaning, as far as its devotees are concerned, both of the Torah and of human life itself. In describing the God of the Kabbalists as a figure of myth, we mean to say that the fragmented narratives and scriptural interpretations found in the Bahir and other early Kabbalistic writings refer to a secret inner life of God, lifting the veil from the ancient Jewish insistence on monotheism and revealing a complex and multifaceted divine realm, in sharp contrast to the well-known ancient adage of Ben Sira, do not seek out what is too wondrous for you, do not inquire into that which is concealed from you. These writings precisely seek to penetrate the inner divine world and to offer hints to the reader about the rich and complex life to be found there. Of course, outright polytheism like that of the pagan Gnostic groups of late antiquity is out of the question here at the heart of a medieval Jewry that defined itself through proud and devoted attachment to the faith in one God. What we seem to discover in the early Kabbalah are various stages of divine life, elements within the Godhead that interact with one another. In the Bahir, these potencies relate quite freely and mysteriously with one another. A fixed pattern of relationships is somehow vaguely in the background, but not clearly presented. In the century of development following the Bahir's publication 1150 to 1250, the system comes to be quite firmly fixed. It is that pattern that lies behind the fanciful and multi-layered creativity of the Zohar. What we are speaking of here is the realm of divine entities that are called Sephirot by early Kabbalistic sources. The term originates in Sefer Yetzirah, where it refers to the 10 primal numbers which, along with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, comprise the 32 wondrous paths of wisdom or the essential structure of existence. For the Kabbalist, it is these forces and the dynamic interplay among them that constitutes the inner life of the Godhead. To know God, a necessary condition of proper worship. On this point the Kabbalists agree with the philosophers. One must understand the symbolic language of the Sephirot. To be a Kabbalist is to contemplate the flow of energy among the Sephirot and reflect upon their ultimate unity. The non-Bahir writings of early Kabbalah add an important new element to this picture. Here the term Fin Sof begins to appear as the hidden source from which the 10 Sephirot emerge. Originally part of an adverbial phrase meaning endlessly, Ein Sof is used in this context in a nominal sense to designate the endless or that which is beyond all limits. Fin Sof refers to the endless An. undefinable reservoir of divinity, the ultimate source out of which everything flows. Ein Sof is utterly transcendent in the sense that no words can describe it, no mind comprehend it. But it is also ever present in the sense of the old rabbinic adage, he is the place of the world. To say that Fin Sof is there but not here would entirely falsify the notion. Nothing can ever exist outside of Ein Sof. It is thus not quite accurate to say that the Sephirot emerge or come out of Fin Sof. Within the hidden reaches of infinity, in a way that of necessity eludes human comprehension, there stirs a primal desire, the slightest rippling in the stillness of cosmic solitude. That desire, not a change, the more philosophically oriented Kabbalist hastens to add, but an aspect of reality that has been there forever, draws the infinite well of energy called Fin Sof towards self-expression, a becoming manifest or a concretization that begins with the subtlest of steps, moves toward the emergence of God as divine persona, manifests its spectrum of energies in the fullness of the 10 Sephirot, and then spills over with plenitude to create all the lower worlds, including, as its very lowest manifestation, the material universe. The Sephirot are thus a revelation, a rendering more accessible, of that which has existed in Fin Sof all along. We are now ready to trace the pattern of the Sephirot and the essential symbols associated with them. The description in the following paragraphs does not summarize any particular passage in a single Kabbalistic text, but attempts to offer a summary understanding of the Sephirot as they were portrayed in the emerging Castilian Kabbalah of the late 13th century. See the diagram of the 10 Sephirot, above. Page Psi. The highest Sephirah represents the first stirrings of intent within Fin Sof, the arousal of desire to come forth into the varied life of being. There is no specific content to this Sephirah, it is a desire or intentionality, an inner movement of the spirit, that potentially bears all content, but actually none. It is therefore often designated by the Kabbalists as nothing. This is a stage of reality that lies between being wholly within the one and the first glimmer of separate existence. Most of the terms used to describe this rather vague realm are apophatic in nature, describing it negatively. The air, or ether, that cannot be grasped is one favorite, the hidden light is another. The prime pictorial image assigned to it is that of the crown, Keter, the starting point of the cosmic process. Sometimes this rung of being is referred to as Keter Elyon, the supreme crown of God. This image is derived partly from a depiction of the 10 Sephirot in anthropic form, that is to say, in the image of a human being. Since this personification is of a royal personage, the highest manifestation of that emerging spiritual body will be the crown. But we should also recall that the more primary meaning of the word Keter is circle. It is from this that the notion of the crown is derived. In Sefer Yetzirah we are told that the Sephirot are a great circle, their end embedded in their beginning, and their beginning in their end. The circularity of the Sephirot will be important to us further along in our description. Out of Keter emerges Chokmah, the first and finest point of real existence. All things, souls, and moments of time that are ever to be, exist within a primal point, at once infinitesimally small and great beyond measure. Like mystics everywhere, Kabbalists love the language of paradox, a way of showing how inadequate words really are to describe this reality. The move from Keter to Chokmah, the first step in the primal process, is a transition from nothingness to being, from pure potential to the first point of real existence. The Kabbalists are fond of describing it by their own reading of a verse from Job's hymn to wisdom. Wisdom comes from nothingness. Job 28 hours and 12 minutes. All the variety of existence is contained within Chokmah, ready to begin the journey forward. But Chokmah, meaning wisdom, is also the primordial teaching, the inner mind of God, the Torah that exists prior to the birth of words and letters. As being exists here in this ultimately concentrated form, so too does truth or wisdom. The Kabbalists are building on the ancient midrashic identification of Torah with primordial wisdom and the midrashic reading of in the beginning as through wisdom God created the world. Here we begin to see their insistence that creation and revelation are twin processes, existence and language, the real and the nominal, emerging together from the hidden mind of God. As the primal point of existence, Chokmah is symbolized by the letter Yod, smallest of the letters, the first point from which all the other letters will be written. Here all of Torah, the text and the commentary added to it in every generation, indeed all of human wisdom, is contained within a single Yod. This Yod is the first letter of the name of God. The upper tip of the Yod points toward Keter, itself designated by the Aleph or the divine name Ehyeh. This journey from inner divine nothingness toward the beginning of existence is one that inevitably arouses duality, even within the inner realms. As Chokmah emerges, it brings forth its own mate, called Bina, understanding or contemplation. Chokmah is described as a point of light that seeks out a grand mirrored palace of reflection. The light seen back and forth in those countless mirrored surfaces is all one light, but infinitely transformed and magnified in the reflective process. Chokmah and Bina are two that are inseparably linked to one another. Either is inconceivable to us without the other. Chokmah is too fine and subtle to be detected without its reflections or reverberations in Bina. The mirrored halls of Bina would be dark and unknowable without the light of Chokmah. For this reason they are often treated by Kabbalists as the primal pair, ancestral Abba and Ima, father and mother, deepest polarities of male and female within the divine and human self. The point and the palace are also primal male and female, each transformed and fulfilled in their union with one another. The energy that radiates from the point of Chokmah is described chiefly in metaphors of flowing light and water, verbal pictures used by the mystics to speak of these most abstract levels of the inner mind. But images of sexual union are never far behind these. The flow of light is also the flow of seed that fills the womb of Bina and gives birth to all the further rungs within the 10-in-1 divine structure, the 7 lower Sephirot. This first triad of Sephirot together constitutes the most primal and recondite level of the inner divine world. It is a reality that the Kabbalist regularly claims is quite obscure and beyond human ken, although the many references to Kavanah reaching Keter and to the union of all the Sephirot with their source undercut such assertions. But for most passages in the Zohar, Bina stands as the womb of existence, the jubilee in which all returns to its source, the object of teshuvah, turning, returning, in short, the highest object of the religious quest to return to the source. Out of the womb of Bina flow the 7 lower Sephirot, constituting 7 aspects of the divine persona. Together these comprise the God who is the subject of worship and the one whose image is reflected in each human soul. The divine self, as conceived by Kabbalah, is an interplay of these 7 forces or inner directions. So too is each human personality, God's image in the world. This holy structure of the inner life of God is called the mystery of faith by the Zohar and is refined in countless images by Kabbalists through the ages. God, in other words, is the first being to emerge out of the divine womb, the primal entity to take shape as the endless energies of Fin Sof begin to coalesce. These 7 Sephirot, taken collectively, are represented in the spatial domain by the 6 directions around a center, in the tradition of Sefer Yetzirah, and in the realm of time by the 7 days of the week, culminating in the Sabbath. Under the influence of Neoplatonism, the Kabbalists came to describe the Sephirot as emerging in sequence. This sequence does not necessarily have to be one of time, as the Sephirot comprise the inner life of YHVH, where time does not mean what it does to us. The sequence is rather one of an intrinsic logic, each stage a response to that which comes before it. The structure consists of 2 dialectical triads, sets of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and a final vehicle of reception that also energizes the entire system from below, corresponding to Keter at the upper end. First to manifest is Hist, the grace or love of God. The emergence of God from hiding is an act filled with love, a promise of the endless showering of blessing and life on all beings, each of whose birth in a sense will continue this process of emerging from the one. This gift of love is beyond measure and without limit, the boundless compassion of Keter now transposed into a love for each specific form and creature that is ever to emerge. This channel of grace is the original divine Shefa, the bounteous and unlimited love of God. But the divine wisdom also understands that love alone is not the way to bring forth other beings and to allow them their place. Judaism has always known God to embody judgment as well as love. The proper balance between these two, ever the struggle of the rabbis themselves loving the people as well as the law, is a struggle that Jewish sources have long seen as existing in God as well. Hist therefore emerges linked to its own opposite, described both as Din, the judgment of God, and Jevira, the bastion of divine power. This is a force that measures and limits love, that controls the flow of Hist in response to the needs, abilities, and deserts of those who are to receive it. Hist represents the God of love, calling forth the response of love in the human soul as well. Jevira represents the God we humans fear, the one before whose power we stand in trembling. The Kabbalists saw Hist as the faith of Abraham, described by the prophet as Abraham my lover, Isaiah 41:8. Abraham, the first of God's true earthly followers, stands parallel to Hist, the first quality to emerge within God. He is the man of love, the one who will leave all behind and follow God across the deserts, willing to offer everything, even to place his beloved son upon the altar, for love of God. Jevurah, on the other hand, is the God-called fear of Isaac. Genesis 31 hours and 42 minutes. This is the divine face Isaac sees when bound to that altar, confronting the God he believes is about to demand his life. Isaac's piety is of a different quality than his father's. Trembling obedience, rather than love, marks his path through life. In the Zohar, the fear of Isaac is sometimes depicted as a god of terror. The linking together of Hist and Jevurah is an infinitely delicate balance. Too much love and there is no judgment, none of the moral demand that is so essential to the fabric of Judaism. But too much power or judgment is even worse. The Kabbalists see this aspect of the divine and human self as fraught with danger, the very birthplace of evil. Jevurah represents the left side of the divine as the Sephirot emerge in human-like form. The Zohar speaks of a discontent that arises on this left side of God. Jevurah becomes impatient with Hist, unwilling to see judgment set aside in the name of love. Rather than permitting love to flow in measured ways, Jevurah seeks for some cosmic moment to rule alone, to hold back the flow of love. In this moment, divine power turns to rage or fury. Out of it all the forces of evil are born. Darkness emerging from the light of God, a shadow of the divine universe that continues to exist throughout history, sustained by the evil wrought by humans below. Here we have one of the most important moral lessons of Kabbalah: judgment, not tempered by love, brings about evil. Power obsessed with itself turns demonic. The force of evil is often referred to by the Zohar as Sidra, the other side, indicating that it represents a parallel emanation to that of the Sephirot. But the origin of that demonic reality that both parallels and mocks the divine is not in some other distant force. The demonic is born of an imbalance within the divine, flowing ultimately from the same source as all else, the single source of being. The proper balance of Hist and Jevurah results in the sixth Sephirah, the center of the Sephirotic universe. This configuration represents the personal God of biblical and rabbinic tradition. This is God seated on the throne, the one to whom prayer is most centrally addressed. Poised between the right and left forces within divinity, the Blessed Holy One is the key figure in a central column of Sephirot, positioned directly below Keter, the divine that precedes all duality. The sixth Sephirah is represented by the third patriarch, Jacob, also called Israel, the perfect integration of the forces of Abraham and Isaac, the God who unites and balances love and fear. Non-personal designations for this sixth Sephirah include Tiferet, beauty, splendor, Rahman, compassion, Mispat, balanced judgment, and Emet, truth. The three consonants of Emet represent the first, middle, and last letters of the alphabet. Truth is stretched forth across the whole of being, joining the extremes of right and left, Hist and Jevurah, into a single integrated personality. Thus is the sixth Sephirah also described as the central beam in God's construction of the universe. Adopting a line from Moses' tabernacle, Exodus 26 hours and 28 minutes, depicted by the rabbis as reflecting the cosmic structure, Jacob or the sixth Sephirah is called the central beam, reaching from one end unto the other. In Jacob or Tiferet we reach the synthesis that resolves the original tension between Hist and Jevurah, the inner right and left, love and judgment. The Blessed Holy One as a personal God is also the uppermost manifestation called Israel, thus serving as a model of idealized human personality. Each member of the house of Israel partakes of this Godhead, who may also be understood as a totemic representation of his people below. Jacob is in this sense the perfect human, a new Adam, according to the sages, the radiant-faced elder extending blessing through the world. This is also the God of imitatio Dei. In balancing their own lives, the people of Israel imitate the God who stands at the center between right and left, balancing all the cosmic forces. That God knows them and sees himself in them, meaning that the struggle to integrate love and judgment is not only the great human task, but also a reflection of the cosmic struggle. The inner structure of psychic life is the hidden structure of the universe. It is because of this that we can come to know God by the path of inward contemplation and true self-knowledge. The key dialectical triad of Hist Jevurah Tiferet is followed on the Kabbalistic chart by a second triad, that of the Sephirot Netzah, Hod, and Yesod, are ranged in the same manner as those above them. Little that is new takes place on this level of divinity. These Sephirot are essentially channels through which the higher energies pass on their way into the 10th Sephirah, Malkut or Shekinah, the source of all life for the lower worlds. The only major function assigned to Netzah and Hod in the Kabbalistic sources is their serving as the sources of prophecy. Moses is the single human to rise to the level of Tiferet, to become bridegroom of the Shekinah. Other mortals can experience the Sephirotic universe only as reflected in the Shekinah, the single portal through which they can enter. This is the formal view of the Kabbalists, though it is a position exceeded by a great many passages in the Zohar and elsewhere. The prophets other than Moses occupy an intermediate position, receiving their visions and messages from the 7th and 8th Sephirot, making prophecy a matter of participation in the inner Sephirotic life of God. The 9th Sephirah represents the joining together of all the cosmic forces, the flow of all the energies above now united again in a single place. In this sense the 9th Sephirah is parallel to the 2nd. Chokmah began the flow of these forces from a single point. Now Yesod, foundation, as the 9th is called, reassembles them and prepares to direct their flow once again. When gathered in Yesod, it becomes clear that the life animating the Sephirot, often described in metaphors of either light or water, is chiefly to be seen as male sexual energy, specifically as semen. Following the Greek physician Galen, medieval medicine saw semen as originating in the brain, Chokmah, flowing down through the spinal column, the central column, Tiferet, into the testicles Netzah and Hod, and thence into the phallus, Yesod. The Sephirotic process thus leads to the great union of the 9 Sephirot above, through Yesod, with the female Shekinah. She becomes filled and impregnated with the fullness of divine energy, and she in turn gives birth to the lower worlds, including both angelic beings and human souls. The biblical personality associated with the 9th Sephirah is Joseph, the only figure regularly described in rabbinic literature as tzaddik or righteous. He is given this epithet because he rejected the wiles of Potiphar's wife, making him a symbol of male chastity or sexual purity. The Sephirah itself is thus often called tzaddik, the place where God is represented as the embodiment of moral righteousness. So too is Yesod designated as Berit or covenant, again referring to sexual purity through the covenant of circumcision. But there is more than one way to read these symbols. The 9th Sephirah stands for male potency as well as sexual purity. The Kabbalists resolutely insist that these are ideally identical and are not to be separated from one another. Of course, sexual transgression and temptation were well known to them. The circle of the Zohar was quite extreme in its views on sexual sin, and on the great damage it could cause both to soul and cosmos. But the inner world of the Sephirot was completely holy, a place where no sin abided. Here the flow of male energy represented only fruitfulness and blessing. The fulfillment of the entire Sephirotic system, especially as seen in Castile, lay in the union of these two final Sephirot. Yesod is, to be sure, the agent or lower manifestation of Tiferet, the true bridegroom of the Song of Songs, or the king who weds the Matronida, Shekinah, as the grand lady of the cosmos. But the fascination with the sexual aspect of this union is very strong, especially in the Zohar, and that leads to endless symbolic presentations of the union of Yesod and Malkut, the feminine 10th Sephirah. By far the richest network of symbolic associations is that connected with the 10th and final Sephirah. As Malkut, kingdom, it represents the realm over which the king, Tiferet, has dominion, sustaining and protecting her as the true king takes responsibility for his kingdom. At the same time, it is this Sephirah that is charged with the rule of the lower world. The blessed Holy One's Malkut is the lower world's ruler. The biblical personage associated with Malkut is David, somewhat surprisingly, given its usual femininity, the symbol of kingship. David is also the psalmist, ever crying out in longing for the blessings of God to flow from above. While Malkut receives the flow of all the upper Sephirot from Yesod, she has some special affinity for the left side. For this reason she is sometimes called the gentle aspect of judgment, a mitigated version of Jevurah. Several Zohar passages, however, paint her in portraits of seemingly ruthless vengeance in punishing the wicked. A most complicated picture of femininity appears in the Zohar, ranging from the most highly romanticized to the most frightening and bizarre. The last Sephirah is also called Shekinah, an ancient rabbinic term for the indwelling divine presence. In the medieval Jewish imagination, this appellation for God had been transformed into a winged divine being, hovering over the community of Israel and protecting them from harm. The Shekinah was also said to dwell in Israel's midst, to follow them into exile, and to participate in their suffering. In the latest phases of Midrashic literature, there begins to appear a distinction between God and his Shekinah, partly a reflection of medieval philosophical attempts to assign the biblical anthropomorphisms to a being less than the Creator. The Kabbalists identify this Shekinah as the spouse or divine consort of the Blessed Holy One. She is the 10th Sephirah, therefore a part of God included within the divine 10 in one unity. But she is tragically exiled, distanced from her divine spouse. Sometimes she is seen to be either seduced or taken captive by the evil hosts of Sitra. Then God and the righteous below must join forces in order to liberate her. The great drama of religious life, according to the Kabbalists, is that of protecting Shekinah from the forces of evil and joining her to the holy bridegroom whoever awaits her. Here one can see how medieval Jews adapted the values of chivalry, the rescue of the maiden from the clutches of evil, to fit their own spiritual context. As the female partner within the divine world, the 10th Sephirah comes to be described by a host of symbols, derived both from the natural world and from the legacy of Judaism, that are classically associated with femininity. She is the moon, dark on her own but receiving and giving off the light of the sun. She is the sea, into whom all waters flow, the earth, longing to be fructified by the rain that falls from heaven. She is the heavenly Jerusalem, into whom the king will enter. She is the throne upon which he is seated, the temple or tabernacle, dwelling place of his glory. She is also Knesset Yisrael, the embodied community, or assembly, of Israel itself, identified with the Jewish people. The 10th Sephirah is a passive receptive female with regard to the Sephirot above her, receiving their energies and being fulfilled by their presence within her. But she is ruler, source of life, and font of all blessing for the worlds below, including the human soul. The Kabbalist sees himself as a devotee of the Shekinah. She may never be worshipped separately from the divine unity. Indeed, this separation of Shekinah from the forces above was the terrible sin of Adam that brought about exile from Eden. Yet it is only through her that humans have access to the mysteries beyond. All prayer is channeled through her, seeking to energize her and raise her up in order to effect the Sephirotic unity. The primary function of the religious life, with all its duties and obligations, is to rouse the Shekinah into a state of love. All realms outside the divine proceed from Shekinah. She is surrounded most immediately by a richly pictorialized host. Sometimes these surrounding beings are seen as angels, at others, they are the maidens who attend the bride at her marriage canopy. They inhabit and rule over variously described realms or palaces of light and joy. The Zohar devotes much attention to describing 7 such palaces with names that include Palace of Love, Palace of the Sapphire Pavement, alluding to the vision of God in Exodus 24:10, Palace of Desire, and so forth. The palaces, Hekalit, of the Zoharic world are historically derived from the remains of the ancient Merkava or Hekalit mysticism, a tradition that was only dimly remembered by the Zohar's day. In placing the Hekalit beneath the Shekinah, the Kabbalists mean to say that the visionary ascent of the Merkava mystic was a somewhat lesser sort of religious experience than their own symbolic contemplative ascent to the heights of the Sephirotic universe, one that ascended with the Shekinah as she reached into the highest realms. While the inner logic of the Kabbalists' emanational thinking would seem to indicate that all beings, including the physical universe, flow forth from Shekinah, the medieval abhorrence of associating God with corporeality complicates the picture, leaving Kabbalah with a complex and somewhat divided attitude toward the material world. The world in which we live, especially for the Zohar, is a thorough mingling of divine and demonic elements. Both the holy imprint of the 10 Sephirot and the frightening structure of multi-layered Kilipot, or demonic shells, are to be found within it. The Zohar first made its appearance in Castile toward the end of the 13th century. Passages from it are included in works by Castilian and Catalonian Kabbalists writing at about that time. In some cases these are presented as quotations, attributed to Yerushalmi, usually referring to the Jerusalem Talmud, but sometimes also to other work originating in the Holy Land, or to Midrash, particularly the Midrash of Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei. Some refer to it as an ancient work. In other cases, including passages in the writings of well-known Castilian Kabbalist Moses de Leon and the Barcelona author Bahia ben Asher, pieces identical to sections of the Zohar are simply absorbed within their writings and presented as their own. By the second decade of the 14th century, the Zohar is referred to, by the author of Tikkunei Zohar, as a prior or completed document. Large portions of it are by then available to such authors as David Ben Judahi Hasid, who paraphrases and translates various sections, and the Italian Kabbalist Menachem Recanati, who quotes copiously from the Zohar in his own commentary on the Torah. Recanati seems to be the first one to regularly refer to this group of sources by the term Zohar. The question of the Zohar origins has puzzled its readers ever since its first appearance, and no simple and unequivocal statement as to the question of its authorship can be made even in our own day. There is no question that the work was composed in the decades immediately preceding its appearance. It responds to literary works and refers to historical events that place it in the years following 1270. The 1280s seem like the most likely decade for composition of the main body of the Zohar, probably preceded by the Midrash Hanelim and possibly certain other sections. Indeed, it is quite possible that the Zohar was still an ongoing project when texts of it first appeared, and that parts of it were being written even a decade later. Because the question of the Zohar's origins has been so hotly debated by readers and scholars over the centuries, it is important to offer a brief account here of the history of this discussion. Debate about the Zohar's origins began in the very decade of its appearance. Fragments of the Zohar were first distributed by Rabbi Moses Delaine, who claimed that they were copied from an ancient manuscript in his possession. This was a classic technique of pseudepigraphy, the attribution of esoteric teachings to the ancients, to give them the respectability associated with hoary tradition. While some naive souls seem to have believed quite literally in the antiquity of the text and the existence of such a manuscript, others, including some of Deleine's fellow Kabbalists, joined with him in the pretense in order to heighten the prestige of these teachings. While they may have known that De Leon was the writer, and may even have participated in mystical conversations that were reflected in the emerging written text, they did believe that the content of the Zohar's teachings was indeed ancient and authentic. They probably saw nothing wrong in the creation of a grand literary fiction that provided for these ancient yet new teachings an elevated literary setting, one worthy of their profound truth. There were, however, skeptics and opponents of the Zohar right from the beginning, who depicted the whole enterprise as one of literary forgery. Fascinating evidence of this early controversy is found in an account written by the Kabbalist Isaac of Acre, a wandering mystic who arrived in Castile in 1305. A manuscript version of Isaac's account was known to the 16th-century chronicler Abraham Zacuto and was included in his Sefer Yuhazin. Isaac tells us that he had already heard of the Zohar, and came to Castile to learn more about it and specifically to investigate the question of the Zohar's origins. He managed to meet De Leon shortly before the latter's death. Delaine assured him that the ancient manuscript was real, and offered to show it to him. By the time Isaac arrived at Avila, where De Leon had lived in the last years of his life, he had a chance only to meet the Kabbalist's widow. She denied that the manuscript had ever existed, recounting that her husband had told her that he was claiming ancient origins for his own work for pecuniary advantage. Others, however, while agreeing that there was no ancient manuscript source, claimed that Delaine had written the Zohar through the power of the holy name. This might refer either to some sort of trance-like automatic writing or to a sense that he saw himself as a reincarnation of Rabbi Shimon and, through the name, had access to his teachings. Various other players then enter the account in a series of claims and counterclaims, and the text breaks off just before a disciple of Deli 6n is able to present what seems like promising testimony in the Zohar's behalf. This account has been used by opponents of the Zohar and of Kabbalah in general in various attempts to dismiss the Zohar as a forgery and Moses Delaine as a charlatan. Most outspoken among these attempts is that of the 19th-century historian Heinrich Graetz, for whom the Zohar was the epitome of the most lowly, superstitious element within medieval Judaism. Graetz and others assumed that the wife was the one who spoke the truth, all other explanations serving to cover or justify the obvious chicanery of the author. Wanting to denigrate the Zohar, which did not fit the early modern Enlightenment idea of proper Judaism, Graetz did not consider the possibility that Delaine might have told his wife such things for reasons other than there being the simple truth. Sadly, her account may reflect the Kabbalist's assumption of his wife's inability to appreciate his literary intentions. The claim that he did it for the sake of selling books has about it the air of an explanation to a spouse, offered in a dismissive context. Modern Zohar scholarship begins with the young Gershom Scholem's attempts to refute Graetz. He set out in the late 1920s to show that the picture was more complex and that indeed there might be earlier layers to the Zohar. Awed by the vastness of the Zohar corpus, he found it hard to believe that all of it could have been the work of a single author. But in a series of stunningly convincing essays, Scholem reversed himself and came to the conclusion that the entire Zohar had indeed been written by de Leon. He supported this conclusion by careful analysis of the Zohar's language, its knowledge of the geography of the land of Israel, its relationship to philosophy and to earlier works of Kabbalah, and references to specific historical events or dates. Most convincing was Scholem's painstaking philological analysis. Scholem compared the Zohar's unique, and sometimes mistaken, use of Aramaic linguistic forms to characteristic patterns of language to be found, uniquely, he claimed, in de Leon's Hebrew works. Here he believed he had found something of a literary fingerprint, making it finally clear that de Leon was the author. As to the magnitude of the work and its attribution to a single individual, Scholem was consoled by historical parallels, particularly that of Jakob Bohm, a 17th-century German shoemaker, originally illiterate, who had composed a vast corpus of writings under the force of mystical inspiration. But the matter is by no means ended here. The fact that Scholem agreed with Greets on the question of single authorship did not at all mean that he shared in his lowly opinion of the Zohar or its author. The parallel to Bohm in fact sounds rather like the writing through the power of the holy name that had been suggested to Isaac of Acre. Assuming that Moses de Leon did write the entire Zohar, the question became one of understanding how this might be the case. Two specific questions here come to the fore. One concerns the notable differences between the Zohar's various sections. Could one person have written the Midrash Hanelim, with its hesitant, incomplete usage of Sephirotic symbolism, the Idrat, where that symbolism was incorporated and surpassed, and the obscure Matnadin and Hekalit, along with the rich narrative and homilies of the main Zohar text? What can account for all these seeming variations in both literary style and symbolic content? The other question has to do with the intriguing relationship between a single author and the many voices that speak forth from within the Zohar's pages. Is the community of mystics described here entirely a figment of the author's creative imagination? Is there not some real experience of religious community that is reflected in the Zohar's pages? Might it be possible, to take an extreme view, that each of the speakers represents an actual person, a member of the Castilian Kabbalist circle, here masked behind the name of an ancient rabbi? Or is there some other way in which the presence of multiple authors, or participants in the group's ongoing conversations, can be detected within the Zohar's pages? Contemporary scholarship on the Zohar, here we are indebted especially to the writings of Yehuda Leibs and Ronit Meraz, has parted company with Scholem on the question of single authorship. While it is tacitly accepted that de Leon did either write or edit long sections of the Zohar, including the main narrative homiletical body of the text, he is not thought to be the only writer involved. Multiple layers of literary creativity can be discerned within the text. It may be that the Zohar should be seen as the product of a school of mystical practitioners and writers, one that may have existed even before 1270 and continued into the early years of the 14th century. Certain texts, including the Midrash Hanelim, perhaps an earlier recension of it than that which has survived, belong to the oldest stratum of writing. Then the main part of the Zohar, including both the epic tale and teachings of Rabbi Shimon and his disciples, was indeed composed in the decades claimed by Scholem. Work on the Zohar did not cease, however, with the turn of the 14th century or the passing of Moses de Leon. In fact, the author of the Tigkunei Zohar and the Ra'aya Mehimna, seen by Scholem as later addenda to the Zohar corpus, may represent the third generation of this ongoing school. It would have been in his day, and perhaps with the cooperation of several editors, that the fragments of the Zohar as first circulated were linked together into the somewhat larger units found in the surviving 14th and 15th century manuscripts. There is no single, utterly convincing piece of evidence that has led scholars to this revision of Scholem's view. It is rather a combination of factors stemming from close readings of the text and a body of scholarship on it that did not yet exist in Scholem's day. There is considerable evidence of what might be called internal commentary within the Zohar text. The secrets of the Torah are an expansion of the brief and enigmatic Matnadin, as the Idrat comment and enlarge upon themes first developed in the Sifra Ditzniuta. In the Zohar narrative, whole or partial stories are told more than once. one version seemingly an expansion of an earlier recension. The same is true of certain homilies, some of which are repeated in part or whole several times within the text. These expansions and repetitions could be explained as the developing project of a single author. However, when taken together with other factors, the differing sections of the Zohar and the multiple voices that speak within the text, they point more toward multiple or collective authorship. Historical evidence has shown that closed schools or societies Havurat, for various purposes were a common organizational form within Spanish Jewry. The image of Rabbi Shimon and his followers, encountering a series of mysterious teachers in the course of their wanderings, looks rather like a description of a real such school. Meeting various mystics from outside its ranks who were then accepted by the school's leader as legitimate teachers of secret Torah. It is particularly intriguing to compare this fictionalized but historically real school of Kabbalists to another that is rather more clearly described in documents available to us. In neighboring Catalonia, the Kabbalistic school of Nachmanides lasted, side by side with his Halakhic school, for 3 generations. Nachmanides' disciple Solomon ben Adret, ca. 1235, ca. 1310 carried his master's teachings forward to a group of disciples who then wrote multiple commentaries on the secret aspects of Nachmanides' work. That circle was significantly more conservative in its views of Kabbalistic creativity than was the Castilian group. But we could easily imagine a parallel school of Castilian Kabbalists, beginning with the Gnostics of the mid-13th century and extending forward over the same 3 generations, whose collective literary product, much freer and richer in imagination than the Nachmanidean corpus, included the body of work finally edited into what later generations have come to know as the Zohar. It may indeed be that the competition between these 2 schools of mystical thought had some role in advancing the editing process that finally resulted in the Zohar as we know it in its printed version. The Zohar was composed in the Castile of the late 13th century, a period that marked the near completion of the Reconquista and something of a golden age of enlightenment in the history of Christian Spain. As the wars of conquest ended, the monarchy was able to ground itself and establish central authority over the semi-independent and often unruly Spanish nobility. This included responsibility for protection of the Jews, who generally fared better at the hands of kings than at the arbitrary mercy of local rivals. Alfonso X, 12,521,284, was known as El Sabio or the Wise because of his interest in the sciences, which he was willing to learn from Jews and Muslims when necessary, as well as history, literature, and art. Jews retained a high degree of juridical and cultural autonomy, as well as freedom of religious practice. In the Castile of this period, they constituted a significant percentage of city and town dwellers, generally choosing to live in self-enclosed neighborhoods and communities. But Jews were seen by Christian society as barely tolerated outsiders, and they viewed themselves as humiliated and victimized exiles. As an emerging class of Christian burghers came to see the Jews as rivals, the economic opportunities afforded by the early Reconquista years were gradually eroded. Jews were required to wear distinguishing garb, synagogue building was restricted, and various burdens of extra taxation came to be an expected part of Jewish life. Most significantly, Jews were under constant pressure to convert to Christianity in the atmosphere of a church triumphant with the glory of having vanquished the Moorish armies and standing on the verge of ending the stain of Islamic incursion into Christian Europe. Alfonso X commissioned translations of both the Quran and the Talmud into Castilian, partly out of scholarly interest but also as an aid to the ongoing missionary campaign. The success of the Reconquista itself was trumpeted as great testimony to the validity of Christian claims. The Christian supersessionist theology, beginning with the Church Fathers but growing in stridency through the Middle Ages, claimed tirelessly that Judaism after Christ was an empty shell, a formalist attachment to the past, lacking in true faith. This message was delivered regularly in polemical writings, in sermons that Jews were forced to hear, and in casual encounters between Jews and Christians. We should remember that Jews in Spain spoke the same language as their neighbors and lived with them in the same towns and cities. Their degree of isolation from their surroundings was significantly less than that of later Jews in Eastern Europe, the lens through which all Jewish diaspora experience is often mistakenly viewed in our time. In this context, the Zohar may be viewed as a grand defense of Judaism, a poetic demonstration of the truth and superiority of Jewish faith. Its authors knew a great deal about Christianity, mostly from observing it at close hand but also from reading certain Christian works. including the New Testament, which Dominicans and other eager seekers of converts were only too happy to place in the hands of literate and inquisitive Jews. The Kabbalists' attitude toward the religion of their Christian neighbors is a complex one, and it also has come down to us through a veil of self-censorship. Jews writing in medieval Europe, especially those promulgating innovative religious teachings that were controversial even within the Jewish community, must have been well aware that their works would be read by Christian censors, often themselves Jewish apostates, who would make them pay dearly for outright insults to the Christian faith. The Zohar is filled with disdain and sometimes even outright hatred for the Gentile world. Continuing in the old Midrashic tradition of repainting the subtle shadings of biblical narrative in moralistic black and white, the Zohar pours endless heaps of wrath and malediction on Israel's enemies. In the context of biblical commentary, these are always such ancient figures as Esau, Pharaoh, Amalek, Balaam, and the mixed multitude of runaway slaves who left Egypt with Israel, a group treated by the Zohar with special venom. All of these were rather safe objects for attack, but it does not take much imagination to realize that the true address of this resentment was the oppressor in whose midst the authors lived. This becomes significantly clearer when we consider the Zohar's comments on the religion of these ancient enemies. They are castigated repeatedly as worshippers of the demonic and practitioners of black magic, enemies of divine unity and therefore dangerous disturbers of the cosmic balance by which the world survives. Israel, and especially the Kabbalistic companions who understand this situation, must do all they can to right the balance and save the Shekinah from those dark forces and their vast network of accursed supporters on earth. As Moses had fought off the evil spells of Balaam, darkest of all magicians, in his day, so must the disciples of Rabbi Shimon fight those evil forces that stand opposed to the dawning of the messianic light that is soon to come. All of this is said, of course, without a single negative word about Christianity, but Rabbi Shimon and his second-century companions lived in a time when the enemies of biblical Israel had long disappeared from the earth. The same is even more true of the reader in medieval Christian Spain, who is being firmly admonished to join the battle against those who would strengthen the evil forces, wounding or capturing the Shekinah and thus keeping the divine light from shining into this world. It does not require a great deal of imagination to understand who these worshippers of darkness must be. We must remember, of course, that this was also the era when the Christian image of the Jew as magician and devil worshipper was becoming rampant. The Zohar's unstated but clearly present view of Christianity as sorcery is a mirror reflection of the image of Judaism that was gaining acceptance, with much more dangerous consequences, throughout the Christian world. But this is only one side of the picture. As people of deep faith and of great literary and aesthetic sensibility, the Kabbalists also found themselves impressed by, and perhaps even attracted to, certain aspects of the Christian story and the religious lives of the large and powerful monastic communities that were so prominent in Christian Spain. The tale of Jesus and his faithful apostles, the Passion narrative, and the struggles of the early church were all powerful and attractive stories. Aspects of Christian theology, including both the complicated oneness of the Trinitarian God and the passionate and ever-present devotion to a quasi-divine female figure, made their mark on the Kabbalistic imagination. The monastic orders, and especially their commitment to celibacy and poverty, must have been impressive to mystics whose own tradition did not make such demands on them, but who shared the medieval otherworldliness that would have highly esteemed such devotion. The Kabbalists were much disconcerted by the power of Christianity to attract Jewish converts, an enterprise that was given high priority particularly by the powerful Dominican order. Much that is to be found in the Zohar was intended to serve as a counterweight to the potential attractiveness of Christianity to Jews, and perhaps even to the Kabbalists themselves. Of course, this should not be seen as an exclusive way of reading the Zohar, a mystical work which was not composed chiefly as a polemical text. Nevertheless, the need to proudly assert Judaism's spirit in the face of triumphalist Christianity stands in the background of the Zohar and should not be ignored as we read it. 6. The Zohar, as the contemporary reader of the original encounters it, is a 3-volume work, constituting some 1,600 folio pages, ordered in the form of a commentary on the Torah. The first volume covers the Zohar on Genesis, the second volume is Zohar on Exodus, and the third volume completes the remaining 3 books of the Torah. The text is divided into homilies on the weekly Torah portions, taking the form of an ancient midrash. Within this form, however, are included long digressions and subsections of the Zohar, some of which have no relation to this midrashic structure and seem to be rather arbitrarily placed in one Torah portion or another. An addition to the 3 volumes is Zohar Hadash, New Zohar, a collection of materials that were omitted from the earliest printed Zohar editions but were later culled from manuscript sources. Here we find addenda to the Torah portions but also partial commentaries on Ruth, Lamentations, and the Song of Songs. Another work usually considered part of the Zohar literature is Tigkunei Zohar, a Kabbalistic commentary on the opening verse of Genesis that explicates it in 70 ways. This work, along with the Ra'aya Mehimna or Faithful Shepherd passages published within the Zohar itself, mostly taking the form of a commentary on the commandments, is seen by modern scholars to be the work of a slightly later Kabbalist, one who wrote perhaps in the opening decades of the 14th century and saw himself as continuing the Zohar tradition. As stated, the main body of the Zohar takes the form of Midrash, a collection of homiletical explications of the biblical text. The Zohar enters fully into the midrashic genre, even though that form of writing was considered antiquated in the time and place where the Zohar was composed. Its authors were especially learned in Agadah and used it ingeniously, often convincingly portraying themselves as ancient midrashic masters, but the anachronism of their style was intentional. The Zohar is an attempt to recreate a form of discourse that would have seemed appropriate to a work originating with its chief speakers, Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei and those of his circle, who lived in the land of Israel 1100 years earlier. In fact, this medieval midrash is based on a thorough knowledge of the entire earlier Jewish tradition, including rabbinic, philosophical, and esoteric works. Its purpose, as will quickly become clear to the reader, goes far beyond that of the ancient midrashic model. The Zohar seeks nothing less than to place the Kabbalistic tradition, as it had developed over the preceding centuries, into the mouths of these much revered sages of antiquity and to use them as its mouthpiece for showing the reader that the entire Torah is alive with Kabbalistic secrets and veiled references to the mystery of faith as the Kabbalists taught it. In this sense, the Zohar may be seen as an attempt to create a new midrash or, as one scholar has put it, a renaissance of the midrashic art in the Middle Ages. The old midrashic homilies were often preceded by a series of openings, introductory proems in which the homilist would demonstrate his skill, picking his way through a series of biblical associations eventually leading up to the subject at hand. The Zohar too uses such openings, but with a very different purpose in mind. Here the preacher wants to open the scriptural verse itself, remove its outer shell, and find its secret meaning. In this way, the verse itself may serve as an opening or a gateway into the upper world for the 1-3. For a discussion of how these special sections of the Zohar have been handled in this translation, see the translator's introduction. Who reads it? This leads us closer to the real purpose of Zoharic exegesis. The Zohar wants to take the reader inside the divine life. It wants ever to retell the story of the flow of the Sephirot, their longings and union, the arousal of love above and the way in which that arousal causes blessing to flow throughout the worlds. This is the essential story of Kabbalah, and the Zohar finds it in verse after verse, portion after portion, of the Torah text. But each retelling offers a new and often startlingly different perspective. The Zohar is ever enriching the Kabbalistic narrative by means of retelling it from the vantage point of yet another hermeneutic insight. On each page yet another verse, word, or tale of the Torah is opened or uncovered to reveal new insight into the great story of the Zohar, that which it proffers as the truth of the Torah, of the cosmos, and of the reader's soul. In the series of homilies by various speakers around a particular verse or moment in the scriptural text, the Zohar takes its readers through multiple layers of understanding, reaching from the surface layer of plain meaning into ever more profound revelations. A great love of language is revealed in this process. Plays on words and subtle shadings of meaning often serve as ways to a total reconfiguration of the scripture at hand. For this reason, the Zohar's best readers, both traditional and modern, are those who share its endless fascination with the mystery of words, including both their oral and graphic, or spoken and written manifestations. Other Kabbalists contemporaneous with the Zohar were offering multi-leveled readings of scripture as well. Rabbi Bahia ben Asher of Barcelona immediately comes to mind. His Torah commentary, written in the 1290s, offers the best example of the fourfold interpretation of scripture in its Jewish form. Verse after verse is read first for its plain meaning, then according to the way of Midrash, followed by the way of intellect or philosophical allegory, and finally the way of Kabbalah. Rabbi Bahai's work is in fact important as one of the earliest sources for quotations from the Zohar. The Zohar offers no such neat classifications. Insights offered by a group of companions discussing a text may bounce back and forth from readings that could be, and sometimes indeed are, found in earlier midrashic works to ways of reading that belong wholly to the world of Kabbalah. Kabbalistic interpretations are sometimes so well sewn into the midrashic fabric that the reader is left wondering whether the Kabbalistic referent might not indeed be the real meaning of a given biblical verse or rabbinic passage. In one well-known text, the Zohar refers to mystical interpretations as the soul of Torah, distinguished from the narrative that forms the outward garments and the legal derivations that serve as Torah's body, playing on the phrase Gufei Torah, bodies of Torah, that in rabbinic parlance means essential teachings. That text also suggests a further level of readings, the innermost soul of Torah that will not be fully revealed until Messianic times. But when encountering actual passages from the Zohar, it is not easy to determine just where their author stood in the process of undressing the textual bride. Here as almost everywhere, the poesis of the Zohar overflows the banks, thwarting any attempt at gradation or definition. It is mostly within the area of soul or Kabbalistic readings that the assembled sages reveal layer after layer, showing that this level of reading itself is one that contains inexhaustible riches of the imagination. There is not a single mystical interpretation of a verse or passage that is the secret in the eyes of the Zohar. Secret, sod in Hebrew, raza in Aramaic is rather a method, a way of reading that contains endless individual secrets within it. The language of Sephirotic symbolism offers the Zohar limitless opportunities for creative interpretations of scripture. On the one hand, the Zohar speakers and authors exult in the newness and originality of this exegesis. Rabbi Shimon and his disciples speak glowingly of Hidushei Torah, novelli in Torah interpretation, and their great value. God and the angels join in rejoicing over each new insight. But the Zohar also seeks to deny the newness of Kabbalistic interpretation. Not only is the work itself allegedly an ancient one, the interpretive craft of the Zohar goes to a higher, deeper, and hence also more ancient level of the text. As the highest rung within the Godhead is sometimes called a Tiga, the elder or ancient one, so does profound interpretation take Torah back to its antiquity, to its original, pristine, highest state. The Zohar stands within the long tradition of Jewish devotion to sacred study as a religious act. The faithful are commanded to contemplate it day and night. Joshua 1:8, traditionally taken to mean that the study and elaboration of Torah is ideally the full-time obligation of the entire community of male Israelites. Women were exempted from the obligation to study, and only rarely were they offered more than a rudimentary education. This community viewed the Torah as an object of love, and an eros of Torah study is depicted in many passages in the Rabbinic Agadah. Based on biblical images of feminine wisdom, Torah was described as the daughter and delight of God and as Israel's bride. Study of Torah, especially the elaboration of its law, was described by the sages as courtship and sometimes even as the shy, scholarly bridegroom's act of love, the consummation of this sacred marriage. The Midrash on the Song of Songs, compiled in the 6th or 7th century, devotes a large part of its exegesis of that erotic text to discussing the revelation at Sinai and the delights of both God and the sages in the study of Torah. The Zohar is well aware of these precedents and expands upon them in its own richer and even more daring version of Amor Dei Intellectualis. The lush and well-watered gardens of the Song of Songs are the constant dwelling place of the Zohar, where frequent invocation of the canticle is the order of the day. In the Kabbalist's literary imagination, the gardens of Eros in the song, the Pardes or orchard of mystical speculation itself, and the mystical Garden of Eden, into which God wanders each night to take delight in the souls of the righteous, have been thoroughly linked with one another. The description in Genesis 2:10, of paradise, a river goes forth from Eden to water the garden, whence it divides into 4 streams, and certain key verses of the canticle, a spring amid the gardens, a well of living waters, flowing from Lebanon, 4:15, and others, are quoted endlessly to invoke the sense that to dwell in mystical exegesis is to sit in the shade of God's garden. Even more, the mystical exegete comes to understand that all of these gardens are but reflections of the true inner divine garden, the world of the Sephirot, which Sefer HaBahir had already described as lush with trees, springs, and ponds of water. The Zohar is devoted to the full range of religious obligations that the Torah places upon the community of Israel. The mysteries of the commandments and the rhythms of the sacred year very much occupy its pages, even if we discount the somewhat later Ra'aya Mehimna, Faithful Shepherd, section, which is almost wholly devoted to the meaning of the commandments. Both prayer and the ancient temple ritual, the classic Jewish forms of devotion, are given lofty Kabbalistic interpretations, and the figure of the priest in particular is very central to the Zoharic imagination. Still, it is fair to say that the central religious act for the Zohar is the very one in which its heroes are engaged as described throughout its pages, and that is the act of study and interpretation of Torah. Again and again Rabbi Shimon waxes eloquent in praise of those who study Torah, especially those who do so after midnight. They indeed take the place of the priests and Levites of old, who stand in the house of the Lord by night. Those who awaken nightly to study the secrets of Torah become the earthly attendants of the divine bride, ushering her into the chamber where she will unite at dawn with her heavenly spouse. This somewhat modest depiction of the mystic devotee's role in the Hiras Gamos or sacred marriage rite that stands at the center of the Kabbalistic imagination does not exclude a level of emotional mystical reality in which the Kabbalist himself is also the lover of that bride and a full participant in, rather than merely an attendant to, the act of union. Torah in the Zohar is not conceived as a text, as an object, or as material, but as a living divine presence, engaged in a mutual relationship with the person who studies her. More than that, in the Zoharic consciousness Torah is compared to a beloved who carries on with her lovers a mutual and dynamic courtship. The Zohar on the portion Mispadim contains, within the literary unit known as Savadi Mispadim, a description of a maiden in a palace. Here the way of the Torah's lover is compared to the way of a man with a maiden. Arousal within Torah is like an endless courting of the beloved, constant walking about the gates of her palace, an increasing passion to read her letters, the desire to see the beloved's face, to reveal her, and to be joined with her. The beloved in the nexus of this relationship is entirely active. She sends signals of her interest to her lover. She intensifies his passionate desire for her by games of revealing and hiding. She discloses secrets that stir his curiosity. She desires to be loved. The beloved is disclosed in an erotic progression before her lover. Out of a desire to reveal secrets that have been forever hidden within her, the relationship between Torah and her lover, like that of man and maiden in this parable, is dynamic, romantic, and erotic. This interpretive axiom of the work, according to which the relationship between student and that studied is not one of subject and object but of subject and subject, even an erotic relationship of lover and beloved, opens a great number of new possibilities, seeing the act of Torah study as the most highly praised form of devotional activity places the Zohar squarely within the Talmudic tradition and at the same time provides a setting in which to go far beyond it. Here, unlike in the rabbinic sources, the content of the exegesis as well as the process is erotic in character. Formerly it was the ancient rabbis' intense devotion to the text and to the process of Torah study that had been so aptly described by the erotic metaphor. The laws derived in the course of this passionate immersion in the text were then celebrated as resulting from the embrace of Torah, even when they dealt with heave offerings and tithes or ritual defilement and ablutions. The Talmudic Rabbi Akiva, the greatest hero of the rabbinic romance with the text, was inspired by his great love of Torah to derive heaps and heaps of laws from the crowns on each of the letters. That indeed had been the genius of Rabbi Akiva's school of thought. All of Torah, even the seemingly most mundane, belonged to the great mystical moment of Sinai, the day when God gave Torah to Israel and proclaimed his love for her in the Song of Songs. But the authors of the Zohar crave more than this. The content as well as the process has to reveal the great secret of unity, not merely the small secrets of one law or another. In the Zohar, the true subject matter that the Kabbalist finds in every verse is the Hiras Gamos itself, the mystical union of the divine male and female, the eros that underlies and transforms Torah, making it into a symbolic textbook on the inner erotic life of God. But the Zohar is not only a book of Torah interpretation. It is also very much the story of a particular group of students of the Torah, a peripatetic band of disciples gathered around their master Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei. In the main body of the Zohar, there appear 9 such disciples: Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Hizkiah, Rabbi Hiaiah, Rabbi Yos, Rabbi Yisa, and Rabbi Aha. A very significant part of the Zohar text is devoted to tales of their wanderings and adventures, proclamations of their great love for one another, accounts of their devotion to their master, and echoes of the great pleasure he takes in hearing their teachings. While on the road, wandering about from place to place in the four, Melila Helner Esht, the language of mystical experience in the Zohar through its own eyes, in Hebrew, Ph.D. Dis. Hebrew University, 2019. Holy Land. They encounter various other teachers in the form of mysterious elders, wondrous children, merchants, and donkey drivers, all of whom are possessed of secrets that they share with this band of loving and faithful companions. Usually these mysterious figures know more than the wanderers had expected, and Rabbi Shimon's disciples are often outshone in wisdom by these most unlikely figures. That too is part of the Zohar's story. A contemporary scholar notes that there are more than 300 whole and partial stories of this sort contained within the Zohar text. In some places the narrative shifts from the earthly setting to one that takes place partly in heaven or the Garden of Eden, in which the master is replaced by God himself, who proclaims his pleasure at the innovations offered as the Kabbalists engage in Torah. These tales of Rabbi Shimon and his disciples, wandering about the Galilee 1,000 years before the Zohar was written, are clearly a work of fiction. But to say that is by no means to deny the possibility that a very real mystical brotherhood underlies the Zohar and shapes its spiritual character. Anyone who reads the Zohar over an extended period of time will come to see that the interface among the companions and the close relationship between the tales of their wanderings and the homilies they occasion are not the result of fictional imagination alone. Whoever wrote the work knew very well how fellow students respond to companionship and support and are inspired by one another's glowing rendition of a text. He, or they, has felt the warm glow of a master's praises and the shame of being shown up by a stranger in the face of one's peers. The Zohar, leaving aside for now the question of who actually penned the words, reflects the experience of a Kabbalistic circle. It is one of a series of such circles of Jewish mystics, stretching back in time to Qumran, Jerusalem, Provence, and Girona, and forward in history to Saved, Padua, Midzabaz, Bratslav, and again to Jerusalem. The small circle of initiates gathered about a master is the way Kabbalah has always happened, and the Zohar is no exception. In fact, the collective experience of this group around Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei as recorded in the Zohar forms the paradigm for all later Jewish mystical circles. The group life reflected in the text is that of a band of living Kabbalists, except that they occupied Castile of the 13th century rather than the land of Israel of the 2nd. They lived in Toledo and Guadalajara rather than Tiberias and Sepphoris. Whether these real Kabbalists wandered about in the Spanish countryside as their fictional counterparts did in the Holy Land is hard to know, but they certainly felt that the most proper setting for study of Torah was out of doors, especially in a garden or a grove of trees. Occasionally the companions in the Zohar's pages have conversations indoors, as when the disciples visit Rabbi Shimon or they all travel to the home of Rabbi Pinhas son of Yair. Interestingly, there is no house of study or synagogue that appears as a setting for any of their encounters. The Zohar very much prefers that they take place under the shade of a certain tree, at a spring of water, or at some similar place that might call to mind a verse from a psalm or the Song of Songs, with which a homily might then open. The very frequent references in the text to the importance of secret Torah study at night raises the likelihood that this group of Spanish Kabbalists shared for some time, as a regular, ritualized activity, a late-night session for the study of Kabbalah. If they were anything like their fictional counterparts, these sessions began after midnight and went until dawn, concluding with morning prayers. These nightly gatherings, of course there is no way to be certain whether or for how long they did take place on an actual level, were omitted on the Sabbath, when it was the companion's duty to be at home with his wife. They reached their annual climax on the eve of Shavuot, when the vigil was in preparation for a new receiving of the Torah. The intense climax of the Zohar narrative is the tale of two great and highly ritualized meetings of master and disciples in the Idra, a special chamber of assembly. In the first of these two assemblies, 3 of the companions die in the ecstasy of their mystical devotions. The second, the Idra Zuda or Lesser Assembly, records the death of Rabbi Shimon himself and forms the grand conclusion of the Zohar. Gershom Scholem once suggested that the Zohar takes the form of a mystical novel. This suggestion is particularly intriguing because the Zohar appeared in Spain some 300 years before Cervantes, who is often seen as the father of the modern novel. One may see the tales of Rabbi Shimon and the companions as a sort of novel in formation, but it is clear that the form is quite rudimentary. When the Zohar wants to express an idea, it needs to slip back into the more familiar literary form of textual hermeneutics. The novelist in the classic post-Cervantes sense is one who can develop ideas or suggest complex thought patterns by means of character development and plot themselves, rather than by having the characters assemble and make a series of speeches to one another. Though such moments are not entirely unknown in later fiction, it might be interesting to place the Zohar into the setting of such works as medieval troubadour romances, Chaucer's 14th-century Canterbury Tales, or The Thousand and One Nights. All of these are narrative cycles, frameworks of story into which smaller units, in these cases narrative, in the Zohar's case homiletical, can be fitted. All of them, too, may be seen as precursors of the novel. But the peregrinations of Rabbi Shimon and his disciples are more than the story of the Zohar, whether fictional or masking a historical reality. In the Zohar, everything is indeed more than it appears to be. Master and disciples represent wandering Israel, both the ancient tribes in the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land, and the people of Israel in their present exile. While the ancient rabbis suggest to the would-be scholar to exile yourself to a place of Torah, here exile or wandering is itself that place. The place of Torah is indeed wherever the companions happen to be, the home of the master or the grove of trees. Said in words that they might prefer, the garden of mystical conversation follows them wherever they wander, just as Miriam's movable well gave drink to Israel throughout their 40-year trek through the wilderness. The adventures of the companions show their participation in Israel's greatest suffering, that of exile. Israel's historic exile, however, is itself symbolic, an earthly representation of a still greater exile, that of the Shekinah from her divine spouse. The nature and origin of this inner divine exile is one of the Kabbalists' great mysteries. Some passages, both in the Zohar and in earlier sources, attribute it to the sin of Adam and Eve. In this sense, Kabbalah may be said to have a true sense of the fall or original sin of humans, much more so than the older rabbinic sources. The world as first created was a true Garden of Eden because the Blessed Holy One and Shekinah were face to face, joined in constant embrace like that of the upper Sephirot Chokmah and Binah. Divine blessing thus coursed through the system without interruption, flowing through all of Shekinah's hosts and palaces into an idealized lower world as well. Only Adam and Eve's sin, sometimes depicted as that of separating Shekinah from the upper Sephirot to worship her alone, symbolized by the separation of the tree of knowledge from its roots in the tree of life, disturbed this initial harmony, which since the expulsion from Eden has been sporadic rather than constant, dependent upon the balance of human virtue and transgression. But other passages express a somewhat darker vision of the exile within God. Here the very existence of the lower worlds is an after-effect of divine exile and would not have taken place without it. Some of these sources employ the old Platonic myth of androgyny, embedded in an ancient midrashic description of Adam and Eve, to explain the cosmic reality. Adam and Eve, according to the Agadah, were Siamese twins, conjoined back to back. This single being is that described in Genesis 1:27. God created the human in his form. In the divine form he created him. Male and female he created them. The forming of Eve from Adam's rib, or side, in the following chapter is the separation of this pair, in which they are first turned face to face to one another, so that they might meet, see one another, and unite to propagate the species, fulfilling God's first command. The Kabbalists claim that in this sense two humans are made in God's image. The Sephirot, Tiferet and Malkut were a single entity, back to back. They had to be sought apart, a rather violent choice of verb, so that they might be properly united. Only through this union does the divine life begin to flow outward, giving life to worlds below, in order for our life to come about. In other words, God has to undergo a transformative act of great pain, one in which the divine becomes separated from itself, its future reunification to depend entirely upon the actions of these creatures below. Here exile and suffering are inherent in the cosmos, and the balm provided by human goodness is somewhat more superficial, an oasis of relief in the wandering that is indeed the necessary human and cosmic condition. It is this exile that the Kabbalists are acting out in their wanderings through the Galilee of their imagination. In this sense, it may indeed be said that the Zohar in its entirety is a symbolic work, not just a collection of symbolic interpretations of Scripture. The narratives themselves may be seen as the most profoundly symbolic and Kabbalistic part of the Zohar's oeuvre, not just a framework into which the homilies are woven. 7. Our discussion to this point leads us now to confront the question of the Zohar and religious mystical experience. A first reading of the Zohar might give one the impression of a work that is more mythical than mystical in content, i.e., more involved with the narrative of cosmic origins and structures than it is with inner experience, the soul, or higher states of consciousness. But this view is partially misleading. To read the Zohar well is to fathom the experiential dimension of the entire text, including narrative, exegesis, cosmology, and all the rest. The Kabbalist speaking in the Sephirotic idiom is laying bare the innermost structure of reality as he both understands and experiences it. That same structure is reflected in the cosmos, in Torah, and in the human, or more precisely, Jewish, soul. The language of Sephirotic symbolism provides a new lens through which to see Torah, but the power of that reading, especially as practiced in the circle of the Zohar, offers more than a hermeneutic. To open one's inner eyes to the new reality created by that pattern of thinking is to live within the realm of the Sephirot themselves. The transformations of language and inner experience go hand in hand with one another. The breakthrough in consciousness to a higher realm of contemplative existence is conveyed through the vehicle of self-expression in Sephirotic terms. Therefore, to speak of the origins of the Sephirotic universe, or to interpret the Torah text in terms of Sephirotic symbols, is also to enter into those places within the soul. For the speakers within the Zohar, as for the ideal Kabbalist in any time, to speak of the Sephirot is not only to draw on a body of esoteric knowledge, but also to enter the inner universe where Sephirotic language is the guide to measured experience. The authors of the Zohar do not generally feel the need to tell their readers that this is the case. In a work written for initiates, the link between the intellectual and experiential dimensions was taken for granted. It is primarily the frequent expressions of enthusiasm and ecstasy with which the text is dotted that serve to indicate how deeply and personally the Sephirotic teachings were felt. The repeated refrain, "Had I come into the world only to hear this, it would be sufficient," and the kisses showered upon speakers by their grateful companions make it clear to any but the most obtuse of readers that in the pages of the Zohar we are witnessing the shared inner life of a vital mystical circle and not merely a series of exercises in biblical homiletics. The Sephirotic universe as a representation of inner religious experience may be described in more specific ways as well, though these are surely not exhaustive. The descent of the Sephirot, beginning with Keter, is said to describe the emergence of God from hiddenness to revelation. Both the creation of the world and the giving of Torah are this worldly extensions of that inner divine process. On a more realistic plane, however, so too is the mystic's own inner life. Sephirotic symbolism provides a language for describing the mystic's own return from an experience of absorption in the nothingness of God and gradual reintegration into the framework of full human personality, the re-emergence of conscious selfhood. It should be emphasized that the Zohar never makes such a claim. In general, the Kabbalists were loath to speak too openly about the experiential aspects of their teaching, especially when it came to the highest triad of the Sephirotic world. To speak in terms that claimed direct experience was considered far beyond the bounds of propriety. But one who reads the Kabbalists with an eye to comparative and phenomenological descriptions of mysticism cannot but suspect that such experience underlies the sources. The accounts of a mysterious energy that flows from undefined endlessness, through a primal arousal of will, into a single point that is the start of all being, and thence into the womb palace where the self divine or human is born, sound familiarly like descriptions of the rebirth of personality that follows the contemplative mystical experience. Even though the Zohar depicts it chiefly as the original journey of God, we understand that the mystical life repeats that divine process. In fact, it is out of their own experience that the mystics know what they do of the original journey on which theirs is patterned. Perhaps one can go even a step further to claim that the constant movement within the Sephirotic world, including both the flow of energy downward from Keter and the rising up of Malkut and the lower worlds into the divine heights, represents the dynamic inner life of the mystic and the spiritual motion that ever animates his soul. It is these nuances of inner movement that constitute the real subject of a very large part of the Zohar and the world it creates. To most fully appreciate the Zohar as a mystical text is to understand these movements as reverberations within the mystic soul of events as they transpire within the Sephirotic cosmos that constitutes the divine reality. When the Zohar does speak of mystical experience, It is largely through use of the term devek, attachment or cleaving to God, and its Aramaic cognates. Ever since the early rabbinic discussions of Deuteronomy 4:4, you who cleave to Yhvh your God are all alive today, and 10:20, fear Yhvh your God, cleave to him and serve him, devek has played a central role in the devotional life of pious Jews. But the Zohar is also quick to associate this term with its first biblical usage in Genesis 2:24, where man cleaves to his wife and they become one flesh. Attachment to God, for the Zohar, is erotic attachment, whether referring to the Kabbalist's own attachment to God by means of Torah, to Shekinah's link to the upper male Sephirot as God's bride, or in the rare passages where Moses becomes the Kabbalistic hero and himself weds Shekinah, entering the Godhead in the male role. The contemplative and erotic aspects of attachment to God are just different ways of depicting the same reality, quite wholly inseparable from one another. With the experience of human love and sexuality as its chief metaphor for intimacy, the Zohar depicts devek as a temporary and fleeting experience. Scholars have debated for some time the question of whether true unio mystica is to be found in the Zohar. But this debate may itself hinge on the sexual analogy. Is there true loss of self or absorption within union to be attained in sexual climax? How does one begin to answer such a question without interviewing all of the world's great lovers? Whether or not the experience underlying countless passages in the Zohar can be described as union lies, I would submit, beyond our ken. But it is clear that there is no possibility offered of permanent bliss to those still attached to bodily existence. Only in the world to come will the disembodied spirits of the righteous enjoy the endless delight of basking in the divine presence. Religious experience in this world is but a foretaste of that eternal joy, as the Zohar seeks to develop a language for what we may call its eros of poetic creativity. Exegesis of the Song of Songs plays a major role. The Zohar turns with great frequency, especially in its proems or homiletical warm-ups, to that great font of sacred eros, the Song of Songs. A text in which eros in fact remains unconsummated, offers poetic language for every other aspect of the complete drama of courting, including even loss, separation, and longing. All of these come to the fore in the Zohar's frequent disquisitions on the song, which is often most surprisingly linked to verses describing some aspect of the tabernacle cult or another seemingly dry detail of biblical law. Those texts are utterly transformed by association with the canticle. The Torah text as a whole, it may be said, is washed over in an eroticizing bath created by repeated juxtaposition of Torah texts with verses of the Song of Songs, poetically enriching the eros of Sephirotic symbolization itself. The Zohar learned from the Neoplatonist milieu within which it existed to speak of the flow of energy, usually described as light, from one cosmic realm to the next. The Neoplatonists tended to emphasize the diminution of that light as it reached downward toward the material plane. For the Kabbalist, this constantly renewed pouring forth of divine presence could be felt, both in the daily renewal of nature and in the creative vigor of Torah interpretation. He sought to align himself with the cosmic flow, in order to receive its bounty, but also to act in such ways as to stimulate the flow itself. Images of both light and water abound in the Zohar's pages to describe the Shefa, the endless flux of divine bounty that sustains the universe. In the context of the Zohar, it is clear that this fluid is also the divine seed, that which enters into Shekinah and allows for the constant rebirth of life in the realms beneath her. Read this way, the Zohar is very much a mystical, often even an ecstatic, work, or at least one in which the ecstatic dimension is very highly developed. One of the strongest expressions of this reality is found in the Zohar's powerful and poetic soliloquies around the word Zohar itself, and on the verse, Daniel 12:3, from which the work's title is taken. The enlightened shall shine like the radiance, Zohar, of the sky, and those who lead multitudes to righteousness, like the stars, forever. Zohar represents a hidden radiance issuing forth from the highest Sephirotic realms, a showering of sparks lighting up all that comes in its path. Its inspiration is surely the night sky, the wondrous event of shooting stars against the background of the Milky Way. But like all such images in mystical literature, the beacon of light or drop of divine seed is a pictorial representation of an event that takes place also within the mystic's heart, the inspiration that sparks this creative vision. The inner event of this radiant presence is outwardly manifest in the shining gaze of the Kabbalist's face. The enlightened shall shine is also understood in this rather literal way. Here, As frequently in the Zohar, there is an assimilation of the Kabbalist to the biblical description of Moses as he emerged from the tent of meeting, his face glowing with the radiant presence of God. But the Kabbalist is also Moses' brother Aaron, the ancient priest whose face shines with divine presence as he bestows the blessing of God's own countenance upon the children of Israel. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you. Numbers 6:25 is seen as the Torah's personified way of calling forth the same light that the Kabbalist as Neoplatonist perceives to be shining forth from one cosmic rung to another. He now seeks to become the earthly bearer of that light, transmitting it to his community of disciples and readers. This is the Kabbalist, most often personified in the Zohar by Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei, in the role of tzaddik, conveyor of divine light. A main purpose of the Zohar is to arouse within the reader a constant longing for such enlightenment or inspiration. The great religious creativity, and even the ecstatic deaths, of Rabbi Shimon and his disciples are meant to induce in the reader a sense that he too, as an initiate into the Zohar secrets, may continue in this path. While no generation before the advent of Messiah will fully equal that of Rabbi Shimon, all those who come in his wake are encouraged to follow in his path. The Zohar is thus a highly evocative work, one that seeks to create and sustain a mood of ecstatic devotion. Certain familiar biblical verses, including the garden passages mentioned above, are used as awakeners. One might almost think of them as bells, to regularly restimulate awareness, rousing readers from their daily torpor and reminding them of the constant vital flow needed to quicken the cosmos. This reminder is meant to renew and refresh their participation in Israel's great collective task of rousing Shekinah. She in turn awakens her divine lover to release the flow of light water seed, enveloping her in his presence and renewing the universal flow of life. The Eden, or Lebanon, whence that flow is to come is inaccessible if hidden rung within the divine and human self. It is not just an ancient and lost side of the biblical tale, nor is it only the paradise to which souls will ascend after death. Eden is the upper world, a recondite and inward aspect of being that is mirrored in the garden, the one who needs to be watered by that flow. We creatures of the lower world, trees growing in the garden, need to trace back the course of that river to its source, linking the upper and lower worlds Bina and Shekinah, but also Shekinah and this world, or Shekinah and the soul, so that the flow will never cease. Reflecting on these nature-evoking verses takes us back to the typically outdoor settings of the companions' conversations, which we have mentioned earlier. These settings represent the varied topography of the land of Israel as it existed in the author's imagination, including deserts and vast, forbidding mountains as well as fertile oases and springs of water. The lush garden, especially as evoked in the Song of Songs, is a particularly characteristic setting to inspire such conversations. This may be connected to the much older designation of the place of mystical speculation as Pardes or orchard, but it is related also to the verses quoted here and to the series of connected gardens in which the Kabbalist sees himself as dwelling. This world is a lower garden, needing constantly to be watered by sources from above, ultimately by the love and sustenance that is the gift of Shekinah. But she too is a garden, nurtured by the river that comes forth from the hidden Eden, itself also a garden in some unknown, mysterious way. Somewhere between this world and Shekinah stands the Garden of Eden that contains the souls of the righteous, both those who have completed their time on earth and those not yet born. It too is divided into upper and lower sections, described in various mythic ways. All of these gardens are linked to one another. The Kabbalist sitting and studying Torah with his companions in an earthly garden, physically in Castile, but imaginatively in the Holy Land, is aware that at the same moment the righteous in the Garden of Eden are also engaged in such study. Their garden is open from above, because it is taught that God himself descends into that garden to take delight in the souls of the righteous. All of these point still higher, toward the Sephirotic gardens, and all these levels of the imagination fructify and enrich one another. The sweet aromas rising from these gardens also play a role in the descriptions of mystical intoxication frequently found in the Zohar's pages. 9. The unique genius that finds expression in the Zohar has everything to do with language. Its homiletical style builds upon midrashic sensitivity to the nuances of biblical language, and often seeks to go beyond it. Underlying every page of the Zohar's reading of Torah is a rich ear for associative links and plays on words, a constant search for hints within the text that will allow for an opening to deeper levels of interpretation. This careful attention to the text is joined to the Zohar's readiness to apply to it the symbolic language of the Sephirot that we have discussed above. It is the interplay between these two factors, heightened midrashic sensitivity and the old-new grid of Sephirotic symbols, that creates the unique and powerful poesis of the Zohar. Another element that plays a key role in the powerful impression the Zohar has made on its readers throughout the generations is the sonorous and seemingly mysterious Aramaic in which it is written. All the sections of the Zohar, except for about half of Midrash Hanelim, are written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. While scholars have devoted much attention to the unique grammatical and syntactical features of the Zohar's Aramaic, few have tried to understand why it is that the Zohar is written in Aramaic and what meaning this surprising choice of language might have had for the work's authors. Aramaic was the spoken language of Jews, both in the land of Israel and in Babylonia, from late biblical times, 4th, 3rd century BC, pound symbol, until after the Islamic conquest and its replacement by Arabic 7th century CE. The Talmud, in both its Babylonian and Palestinian versions, is composed mostly in Aramaic, as are portions of Midrash and other rabbinic writings. The Targum, existing in several versions, is the Old Jewish translation of the Bible into Aramaic. By the time the Zohar was written, Aramaic was a purely literary language for all but a tiny group of Jews in the mountains of Kurdistan. Knowledge of it elsewhere was purely passive, even among rabbinic scholars. Only very rarely was a short treatise or poem still written in Aramaic. The choice to compose the Zohar in Aramaic gave to the work an archaic cast, and this immediately set the stage for its mysterious quality. In Spain of the 13th century, unlike Palestine of the 2nd, Aramaic was a mysterious and only vaguely understood language, presenting secrets in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, a method that had been tried, in brief texts, before the Zohar, shrouded them in an obscuring veil, forcing a slower pace of reading upon those who delved into its pages. It also permitted a certain grandiloquence that might have seemed pretentious in the more familiar vehicle of medieval Hebrew. Images that might have been seen as trivial in Hebrew, especially if frequently repeated, maintained a certain mysterious grandeur when veiled by the obscurity of Aramaic dress. The Zohar's Aramaic made the text slightly, but not impossibly, more difficult for the educated Jewish reader in its day. This was probably the precise intent, to offer the reader a sense that he had come to a more profound, and therefore less penetrable, sort of teaching. With some extra effort, it would reveal to him the secret universe that the Zohar sought to share and pass on to its elite community of readers. Students of the Zohar come quickly to understand that the Aramaic of the Zohar is indeed a penetrable veil. The real difficulty in reading the text is that of mastering the symbolic language and the subtlety with which it was employed. It may also be that the Zohar's composition in Aramaic was not entirely a matter of conscious choice. Perhaps it was something that happened, either in the author's psyche or in the community of mystics where Zoharic teachings were first shared orally. If there was a living community of Kabbalists in Castile in the 1280s, meeting by night in courtyards and gardens to study the secrets of the Torah, in what language did they share those secrets with one another? How did the transition take place from discussing the Hebrew text of Torah in Castilian, their only spoken language, back into Hebrew or Aramaic, for transcription onto the written page? Could it be that the richly vocalic sound of Aramaic, where each noun ends in a vowel, better reflected the sounds of their own speech than did Hebrew? Were they themselves somehow seduced by the mysterious sound of Aramaic to follow it into the fantasy realm represented by the Zohar? These speculations may also be applied to the written text itself, especially if we assume that Rabbi Moses de Leon is the author of large portions of the Zohar. Some 20 Hebrew treatises by de Leon have survived, and several of these have now been published. Compared to the Zohar, they are relatively dull and uninspired. While the doctrinal content is very much the same, they possess little of the poetic muse and freedom of expression that so characterize the Zohar. One has the impression that de Leon stepped into another world when writing the Zohar, and the transition from Hebrew to Aramaic was one of the ways he marked that portal. Working in this other, more dimly perceived language released his muse, as it were, giving him the freedom to soar to heights of imagination and literary excess that he would not have dared attempt in Hebrew. We might almost say that the use of Aramaic was some part of the holy name by which it was said that de Leon had written the Zohar. The Aramaic of the Zohar is indeed a unique composite of dialects and features drawn from ancient literary sources. Details of Skolim's analysis of the Zohar's language can be found in his writings and need not be repeated here. See also the translator's introduction to this volume for further discussion of linguistic questions that have direct bearing on the translation before UX. During the last 2 centuries of Jewish life in Spain, the Zohar continued to be copied and studied among small groups of devotees. It competed with 2 other schools of Kabbalistic thought, the Catalonian and the Abulafian, for the attention of those few interested in mystical pursuits. Some Kabbalists seem to have combined these various approaches, or else to have migrated in the course of their own quests from one school of mystical thought to another. Jewish rationalism was also very much alive in Spain through the 15th century, probably continuing to have a larger following than did Kabbalah. Manuscripts of the Zohar also reached Italy, the Byzantine lands of the eastern Mediterranean, and the Holy Land during this period. It was after the expulsion of Spanish Jewry in 1492 that the influence of Kabbalah entered a period of rapid growth. Various explanations have been offered for this increased interest in the mystical tradition. Some have attributed it to the suffering and despair that visited this once proud group of Jewish communities in the period between 1391 and 1492. The devastation of the age, so it is said, caused Jews to seek out deeper resources of consolation than those offered by the typically optimistic worldview of the philosophers. Others claim that the growth of Kabbalah came as a response of a different sort to the Spanish expulsion. Jews throughout the Mediterranean world, including many Spanish exiles, were shocked and disgraced by the high numbers of Spanish Jews who converted to Christianity in the course of the 15th century. Once again the blame was placed partly at the door of philosophy, the intellectual sophistication of Spanish Jewry having supposedly led to a laxity in religious observance and a relative indifference to the question of religious identity. Yet another view attributes the growth in Kabbalah's influence to the new home cultures in which former Iberian Jews found themselves. Ottoman Turkey, with its closed millet system, in which each faith community held fast to exclusive truth claims and total denigration of all outside influences, was a hospitable environment for precisely the closed-minded Zoharic view of the outside world, rather than the Aristotelian quasi-universalism of the philosophers, which had served the needs of a very different age. Whatever the reason, and a combination of the above factors is most likely, we begin to see new Kabbalistic works written and old ones distributed and explicated in the early 16th century. The Zohar and other works of the Castilian tradition are especially prominent in this period. Perhaps typical is the figure of Rabbi Meir ibn Gabbay, a Turkish Kabbalist who tells us that he was born in Spain in 1481 and left as a child among the exiles. Ibn Gabbay's magnum opus, Avodat HaKodesh, Venice, 1567, is a grand systematization of Kabbalah and a defense of it against philosophy. Typically of the 16th century, Ibn Gabbay knows a great many earlier texts and seeks to harmonize them with one another. But the great source of Kabbalistic truth is the Zohar, which he quotes on virtually every page as the Midrash of Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei. The Kabbalistic conventicles of Saved, which flourished in the late 16th century, also accorded to the Zohar top place as the authoritative source of Kabbalistic truth. Clearly, the choice of Safed as a place of settlement for Jews attached to the Kabbalistic legacy had much to do with its proximity to Meron, the supposed burial place of Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei. His tomb had been a site of pilgrimage for local Jews long earlier, but with the growth of the Safed community it became a truly important shrine. Both Rabbi Moses Cordovero, 1522–1570, who probably immigrated to Safed from elsewhere in the Ottoman realm, and Rabbi Isaac Luria 1534–1572, who came from Egypt, chose to live in Safed because of the nearness of holy graves and the possibility, described by Cordovero in his Sefer Jerushin, of achieving mystical knowledge through prostration upon them. Among the sacred dead of the Galilee, Rabbi Shimon, now acclaimed as the undisputed author of the Zohar, took a central place. Luria specifically hoped to achieve a true understanding of passages in the Zohar by visiting what he believed to be the grave of its author. The return of Kabbalah to the Galilean landscape of the Zohar's heroes fired the imagination of Jews throughout the diaspora. Reports of the holy men of Saved, especially the mysterious figure of Luria, known as Ha'ari HaKadosh, the Holy Lion, were widely copied and printed in several versions. A vast literature of both Kabbalistic writings and ethical or pietistic works influenced by Kabbalah poured forth from the printing presses of Venice, Constantinople, and Amsterdam, to be distributed throughout the Jewish world. It did not take long until the claim emerged that the soul of the Ari was in fact a reincarnation of that of Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei. It was in this period that the Zohar came to be considered not only an ancient and holy book, but a canonical text, bearing authority comparable to that of the Bible and the Talmud. The authority of the Zohar as the prime source of mystical truth had already been considered by 14th-century Kabbalists, some of whom came to view its word as superior to that of Nachmanides, for example, because of its allegedly greater antiquity. Nachmanides was portrayed by these as a modern source, whose word could be set aside by a contrary quotation from the work of Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei. But in the 16th century, it was said that Elijah himself had appeared to Rabbi Shimon, and the Zohar's authority became that of heaven itself. Meir ibn Gabbay traced the Kabbalistic tradition back to Sinai, claiming that Zoharic secrets were given to Moses along with the written Torah. Canonical status, in the context of Judaism, bears with it halakhic authority as well as mystical prestige. If the Zohar contained the true meaning of both written and oral Torah, might it be used as a source of legal authority, especially in ritual and liturgical matters, as well? This question came up among halakhic scholars, especially in the few cases in which the Zohar seemed to contradict the majority opinion of rabbis deciding the law on the basis of Talmudic precedent and its formulation in responsa and codes. In fact, as scholars have shown, these cases mostly turn on local custom, the Zohar reflecting either Franco-German or Old Spanish customs, while the halakha had decided in favor of others. A classic example of such halakhic dispute involving the Zohar concerns the donning of tefillin on the intermediate weekdays of Pesach and Sukkot. The Zohar expresses itself most strongly on the issue, considering the wearing of tefillin on those days an insult to the festival and a virtual sacrilege. Although the halakhic codes mostly tended otherwise, some halakhic authorities bowed to the Zohar, and the use of tefillin on those days was rejected throughout the Sephardic, and later Hasidic communities. Thanks to the influence of the safe revival of mystical studies, Kabbalah became widely known among Eastern European Jews in the 17th century. The works of Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz, a Prague Kabbalist who later settled in Jerusalem, carried the teachings of Ibn Gabbay and Cordovero, among others, to preachers throughout the Ashkenazic communities. Here, too, the Zohar was very widely quoted. Prayer books with Kabbalistic commentaries, including those by both Cordovero and Horowitz, brought Kabbalistic thinking into the realm of actual synagogue practice. The highly mythical Kabbalah of Naftali Bacharach, 17th-century German author of Emma Kamelech, Valley of the King, is primarily influenced by the language and imagery of the Zohar. Another area of the growing canonicity of the Zohar is reflected in its use in liturgical contexts and its appearance in digests of daily religious practice. Various Kabbalistic tikkunim or orders were published throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. These include many collections of Zohar passages to be recited during the vigils of Shavuot and Hoshana Rabbah, at the Sabbath table, and on various other occasions. It came to be understood in this period that oral recitation of the Zohar was efficacious even for those who did not understand its meaning. In the 19th century, vocalized editions of the Zohar were printed to allow for this situation, and to assure that the recitation would nevertheless be performed with some degree of accuracy. There were also various digests produced for daily study recitation, especially in the 18th century. The most widespread of these was called Hagli Yisrael Cairo, 1740, including passages to be recited each day from the Torah, prophets, hagiographa, Mishnah, Talmud, Zohar, ethical guides, and legal digests. The Hemdat Yamim, an anonymous compendium of Kabbalistic praxis Izmir, 1731/32, prescribes readings from the Zohar for nearly every conceivable occasion in the Jewish liturgical year. In both of these compendia, we see the Zohar at the apex of its acceptance and integration into the daily regimen of Jewish spiritual life. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Messianic movement around Sabbatai Tzvi, 1626–1676, swept through the Jewish communities. In the more radical forms of Sabbatinism, the Zohar carried even greater weight as the authority of Talmudic law came to be questioned. The Kabbalistic system of Nathan of Gaza, 1643/4–1680, the great prophet of Sabbatinism, is based on the imagery of the Zohar, and devotion to the Zohar was touted loudly throughout the history of Sabbatianism. Some of the later Ashkenazic Sabbatians, followers of Jacob Frank, came to refer to themselves as Zoharites, Jews who followed the authority of the Zohar while rejecting that of the Talmud and the rabbis. This, of course, would be a spurious claim had the authors of the Zohar been asked their opinion, since they had no intention of rebelling against Talmudic authority. But by this time, and in these circles, the Zohar was being read through the lenses of such radical interpreters as the Ra'aya Mehimna, the 15th century Sefer HaKana, the anonymous work Galilei Razaiah, and the writings of Nathan of Gaza. When seen as the font of this literary tradition, the Zohar could be read as a very radical work indeed. The decline of Sabbatianism in the mid-18th century preceded by only a few decades the beginning of the Enlightenment era in Western Europe and the admission of Jews into a more open and religiously tolerant society. As large numbers of Jews became eager supporters of what they could only see as emancipation, readings of Judaism that supported or fit this new situation became widespread. One feature of this emerging post-Enlightenment Judaism, whether in its Reform or Orthodox versions, was either an open rejection or a quiet setting aside of Kabbalah and the Zohar in particular. Scholem wrote an essay about several obscure 19th-century figures whom he designated as the last Kabbalists in Germany. We have already spoken of Heinrich Grietz's negative views of the Zohar, a position that was widely shared by his contemporaries. While there were a few scholars in the period of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, Adolf Jelinek of Vienna is the most notable, who studied the Zohar. It was mostly neglected by Westernized Jews throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. In Eastern Europe, the situation was quite different. Hasidism, a popular religious revival based on Kabbalah, continued to revere the Zohar and believe in its antiquity. Several significant Zohar commentaries were written within Hasidic circles, and the authors of Hasidic works often referred to the Zohar. Rabbi Pinchas of Korzek, an early Hasidic master, was said to have thanked God that he was born after the appearance of the Zohar, for the Zohar kept me a Jew. Hasidic legend has it that when the Zohar was published by his sons, who owned the printing works in Slauda, they dipped the press in the mikveh, ritual bath before printing each volume. So great was the holy task that was about to come before it. Hasidic masters, because of this legend, went out of their way to acquire copies of the Slauda edition of the Zohar and to study from it. The great opponent of Hasidism, Rabbi Elijah the Gaon, of Vilna, 1720–1797, was also a Kabbalist, and a small group within the circle of his disciples continued the study of Zohar for several generations. Among the Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, the reputation of the Zohar as a holy book was particularly strong. Jews in such far-flung communities as Morocco, Turkey, and Iraq studied it avidly. Simple Jews recited the Zohar much in the way that uneducated Eastern European Jews recited the Psalms. Beginning in the 18th century, Jerusalem became known as a center of Kabbalistic studies, and Jews from throughout these communities went there and studied works that emanated from that center. Outside of Europe, it was primarily the Lurianic Kabbalah that held sway, and the Zohar, while revered, was generally viewed through the Lurianic prism, only as Enlightenment ideas began to spread in the early 20th century, partly through the arrival of European Jews in the colonial era, did the authority of the Zohar come into question. The writings of Scholem, Tishbe, and the scholars following in their wake have done much to make the Zohar intelligible to moderns and to renew interest in its study. Tishbe's Wisdom of the Zohar, translating selected passages from Aramaic into Hebrew, was a highly successful attempt to make the Zohar more accessible to an educated Israeli readership. The interest aroused among scholars of religion by Scholem's highly readable and insightful essays, especially those first presented at the Aranis conferences, served to kindle great interest in Kabbalah within the broader scholarly community. This interest is maintained today thanks to the profound and sometimes provocative studies of Yehuda Leibs and Elliot Wolfson. The important writings of Moshe Idel continue to bring Kabbalah to the attention of the scholarly and intellectual world. The availability of English and other translations, including the selections in Tishbe and anthologies by both Scholem and Matt, have also served the Zohar well in creating readerships outside of Israel. In more recent decades, this intellectual interest in Kabbalah has spread to wider circles, including many who are concerned with questions of symbolism, philosophy of language, and related issues. At the same time, Two other seemingly unrelated phenomena have come together to greatly increase the interest in Zohar studies at the turn of the 21st century. One is the broad interest throughout the Western world in works of mysticism and spirituality. Our age has seen a great turn toward sources of wisdom neglected by 2 centuries of modernity, partly in hope of finding in them a truth that will serve as a source of guidance for the difficult and complex times in which we live. Recently, an interest in the Zohar and Kabbalah has emerged as part of this trend, as is true of all the other wisdoms examined in the course of this broad cultural phenomenon. The interest in Kabbalah includes both serious and trivial or faddist elements. This revival of Kabbalah is a complicated phenomenon within itself, containing expressions of great hunger for religious experience and personal growth, alongside the broader quest for wisdom. This interest has come to be combined with a very different renewal of Kabbalah, primarily in Israel, after the 1967 and 1973 wars. It is manifest in the growth of Kabbalistic yeshivot or academies, the publication of many new editions of Kabbalistic works, and a campaign of public outreach intended to spread the teachings of Kabbalah more broadly. This new emphasis on Kabbalah is partly due to the reassertion of pride in the Sephardic and Mizrahi heritage, where Kabbalah has an important place. It is also in part related to the difficult and trying times through which Israel has lived, resulting in both a resurgence of Messianism and a turn to practical Kabbalah, a long-standing part of Near Eastern Judaism, as a source of protection against enemies and hope of victory over them. The Kabbalah taught in these circles is primarily of the Lurianic variety, as interpreted through a long chain of Jerusalem-based teachers. Some versions of what is proffered as Kabbalah today can only be described as highly debased versions of the original teachings, but the Zohar, even if reinterpreted in Lurianic terms, is revered throughout these circles as the primary font of Kabbalistic truth, the ancient teaching of Rabbi Shimon son of Yohei. How this very complex interweaving of forces will affect the future of interest in Kabbalah is yet to be seen. It is certain, however, that the Zohar will continue to find a place in the hearts of new readers, some of whom will turn to the more authentic and profound aspects of its teachings. It is hoped that these readers will be helped and guided by the present translation and commentary. With WONTP Hagdamat Sefer HaZabar Introduction to the Zohar Abi Hizkiah opened, like a rose among thorns, so is my beloved among the maidens. Song of Songs 2. Who is a rose? Assembly of Israel, for there is a rose, and then there is a rose. Just as a rose among thorns is colored red and white, so Assembly of Israel includes judgment and compassion. Just as a rose has 13 petals, so Assembly of Israel has 13 qualities of compassion surrounding her on every side. Similarly, from the moment 0°79 times, Elohim, 1, God, is mentioned, it generates 13 words to surround Assembly of Israel and protect her. Then it is mentioned again degrees Y again, to produce 5 sturdy leaves surrounding the rose degrees. These 5 are called salvation. 7 they are 5 gates. Concerning this mystery it is written, I raise the cup of salvation. Psalms 116 hours, and 13 minutes. This is the cup of blessing, which should rest on 5 fingers, and no more, like the rose, sitting on 5 sturdy leaves, paradigm of 5 fingers. This rose is the cup of blessing, from the 2nd and 7715x, Elohim, till the 3rd, 5 words appear, from here on, light, created, concealed, contained in the covenant, degrees entering the rose, emitting seed into her. This is the tree bearing fruit with its seed in it. Genesis 1:12. That seed endures in the actual sign of covenant, just as the image of the covenant is sown in 42 couplings of that seed, so the engraved, explicit name is sown in 42 letters of the act of creation. 3. Rabbi Shimon opened, the blossoms have appeared on the earth, the time of pruning has arrived, the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. Song of Songs 2:12. The blossoms are the act of creation, which appeared on the earth, when, on the 3rd day, as is written, the earth brought forth vegetation. Genesis 1:12. Then they appeared on the earth, the time of pruning has arrived, the 4th day, on which the pruning of tyrants, Isaiah 25:5, took place. NXN, Meerut, lights, spelled deficiently, degrees. The voice of the turtle dove is the 5th day, as is written, let the waters swarm, with a swarm of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth. Across the expanse of the sky. Genesis 1:20, generating offspring, is heard as the 6th day, as is written, Let us make a human being. Genesis 1:26. Who was Munksa, Bereshit, in the beginning. Destined to declare acting before hearing. For here is written, 1b, Nye, Nasa, let us make a human being. And there is written, MWY, Nasa, we will do, and we will listen. Exodus 24:7. Degrees in our land is the Sabbath day, paradigm of the land of eternal life. The Zohar, the blossoms, are the patriarchs, who entered the divine mind before creation and entered the world that is coming, where they were treasured away. From there, they emerged, secretly, and were concealed within prophets of truth. Degrees. When Joseph was born, they were concealed within him. When Joseph entered the Holy Land, he planted them there. Then they appeared on earth, were revealed there. When are they visible? When the rainbow is revealed in the world. When the rainbow appears, they are revealed. Then, the time of pruning has arrived, time to excise the wicked from the world. Why are they spared? Because the blossoms have appeared on the earth. Had they not appeared, they would not remain in the world. Nor would the world endure. Who sustains the world, enabling the patriarchs to be revealed? The voice of children engaging in Torah. For the sake of those children, the world is saved. Corresponding to them, we will make you wreaths of gold. Song of Songs 1:11. These are little children, youngsters, as is written, make 2 cherubim of gold. Exodus 25 hours and 18 minutes. Degrees. Rabbi Elazar opened, lift your eyes on high and see, who created these. Isaiah 40 hours and 26 minutes. Lift your eyes on high. To which sight? The sight toward which all eyes gaze. Which is that? Opening of the eyes. 2 degrees. There you will discover that the concealed ancient one, susceptible to questioning, created these. Who is that? Who? The one called end of heaven above, registered sign whose domain extends over everything, since it can be questioned, yet remains concealed and unrevealed. It is called who? Beyond, there is MWA, Bereshit, in the beginning no question. 25. TLHE Zohar. This end of heaven is called who? There is another below, called what? Degrees. What distinguishes the two? The first, concealed one, called who, can be questioned. Once a human being questions and searches, contemplating and knowing rung after rung to the very last rung. Once one reaches there, what do you know? What have you contemplated? For what have you searched? All is concealed, as before. Concerning this mystery it is written, what can I take as a witness to you? What can I compare to you? Lamentations 2:13. When the holy temple was destroyed, a voice cried out, what can I take as a witness to you? What can I compare to you? I take what as a witness to you? Every single day I have called witnesses against you, since days of old, as is written, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. Deuteronomy 30 hours and 19 minutes. I compare you to what? Precisely. Degrees. I crowned you with holy crowns, gave you dominion over the world, as is written, is this the city that was called perfect, crown of beauty, joy of all the earth? Lamentations 2:15. I called you Jerusalem built up, a city bound together. Psalms 122:3. Now, what can I liken to you, to console you? Lamentations, Ibid. 13 degrees. For just as you sit desolate, so it is above, as it were. Just as now, the holy people do not enter you in holy array, so I swear to you that I myself will not enter above until your inhabitants enter you below. Registered sign. This is your consolation. I compare this rung to you completely. But now that you are here, your ruin is vast as the ocean. Ibid. Yet if you say you cannot endure or be healed, then who will heal you? Ibid. Really, that concealed, high rung in which all exists will heal you and raise you up. Who is end of heaven above? What is end of heaven below? Jacob inherited this, running from end to end. Exodus 26 hours and 28 minutes. Degrees. From first end, who, to last end, what? For he stands in the middle. So, who created these? Rabbi Shimon said, Elazar, my son, cease your words, so that the concealed mystery on high, and known to any human, may be revealed. Rabbi Elazar was silent. Rabbi Shimon wept and paused for a moment. Then he said, Eyp Azar, what is these registered sign? If you answer, stars and constellations, they are always visible there and were created by what? As is said, by the word of YHVH the heavens were made. Psalms 33:6. As for things concealed, such would not be referred to as these, for that word indicates something revealed. This mystery was only revealed one day when I was at the seashore. Elijah came and asked me, Rabbi, Do you know the meaning of who created these? I answered. These are the heavens and their array, the work of the blessed Holy One. Human beings should contemplate them and bless him, as is written, when I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars that you set in place. YHVH our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout the earth. Psalms 8, 4, 10. Elijah said to me, Rabbi, the word was concealed with the blessed Holy One, and he revealed it in the academy on high. Here it is. When concealed of all concealed verged on being revealed, it produced at first a single point, degrees which ascended to become thought. Within, it drew all drawings, graved all engravings, carving within the concealed holy lamp a graving of one hidden design, Holy of Holies, a deep structure emerging from thought, called one, me, who, origin of structure, existent and non-existent, deep and hidden, called by no name but who. Seeking to be revealed, to be named, it garbed itself in a splendid, radiant garment and created 7 times, Ella, these degrees NX Ella, attained the name, these letters joined with those, culminating in the name O degrees 79 times, Elohim degrees until it created 75 times, Ella, it did not attain the name O degrees 75 times, Elohim degrees based on this mystery. Those who sinned with the golden calf said NX, Ella, these are your gods, O Israel. Exodus 32, 8 degrees, just as TM, me, is combined with 15 times, Ella, so the name 0 degrees 79 times, Elohim, is constantly polysemous. Through this mystery, the universe exists. Then Elijah flew off. I did not see him. From him I discovered the word, whose mysterious secret I have demonstrated. Rabbi Elazar and all the companions came and bowed down in front of him. Weeping, they said, if we have come into the world only to hear this, it is enough. Rabbi Shimon said, so the heavens and their array were created by 7 meters ma, watt, degrees as is written, when I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars that you set in place, 71 ma, how majestic is your name throughout the earth, your splendor is celebrated above heaven. Psalms 8, 4, 1, above heaven, to attain the name, for it created a light for its light, one enclothed in the other, and it attained a high name. So, in the beginning W19X, Elohim, created Genesis 1, 1, D degrees 719X, Elohim, above, registered sign for M7 Ma was not so, is not composed until these letters, NX, Ella, are drawn from above to below and mother lends daughter her garments, though not adorning her with her adornments. When does she adorn her fittingly? When all males appear before her, as is written, all your males shall appear before the sovereign. YHVH. Exodus 23:17 degrees. This one is called sovereign, as is said, behold, the ark of the covenant, sovereign of all the earth. Joshua 3:11. Degrees. Then the letter 7, he, departs and, yod, enters, and she adorns herself in masculine clothing in the presence of every male in Israel. Degrees. Other letters Israel draws from above to this site, 75 times, Ella, these, I remember. Psalms 42, 5 degrees. With my mouth I mentioned them, in my yearning I poured out my tears, drawing forth these letters. Then I conduct them from above to the house of Elohim, to be Elohim, like him with what? With joyous shouts of praise, the festive throng. Rabbi Elazar said, my silence assembled a temple above, a temple below. Indeed, a word is worth 1 coin. Silence. 2. Registered sign. A word is worth 1 coin. What I said, the meaning I aroused. Silence. 2. By holding my silence, 2 worlds were created, erected as one. Rabbi Shimon said, from here on, the completion of the verse, as is written, the one who brings forth their array by number. Isaiah 40 hours, and 26 minutes. Degrees. These are 2 wrongs, each of which should be inscribed. One is what? The other, who? This is above, that is below. The one above is inscribed by the words, the one who brings forth their array by number, the one who is known, beyond compare. Similarly, the one who brings forth bread from the earth, registered sign. The one who is known, the lower rung, and all is one, by number, 600,000, standing together, generating forces according to their kind, beyond number, and calls them each by name, both the 600,000 and their forces. What does this mean, by name? If you say they were called individually by name, not so, for then the verse should read each by its name. Rather, as long as this rung had not ascended and was still called one, me, who, it did not give birth nor bring forth what was hidden, each according to its kind, though all of them were hidden within. Once it created 7 times, Ella, these, and attained its name, degrees 15 times, Elohim, then by the power of this name, it yielded them perfectly. This is the meaning of calls them each by name, by its very name, it called forth each and every kind to exist perfectly. Similarly, see, I have called by name Bezalel, Exodus 31:2. I mentioned my name so that Bezalel would attain perfect existence, his great might. Isaiah 40 hours, and 26 minutes. What is this? First of rungs, to which all desires ascend, ascending there, to be, secretly, and vast power, mystery of the upper world, which attained the name Elohim, as we have said. Not one is missing, not one of those 600,000 generated by the power of the name, because not one is missing. Whenever any of the children of Israel died as punishment for their sins, the people were counted, and not even one of the 600,000 was lacking, registered signed so that everything accorded with the paradigm. Just as not one is missing above, so not one is missing below. Rav Hamnuna Sava said, we find the letters backward, 1, bet, first, followed by 1, bet, muksna, bereshit, in the beginning, followed by x71 bara, created. Then XX, Aleph, first, followed by X, Aleph, degrees 719 XX, Elohim, followed by an Xet. The reason is, when the Blessed Holy One wished to fashion the world, all the letters were hidden away. For 2,000 years before creating the world, the Blessed Holy One contemplated them and played with them. As he verged on creating the world, all the letters presented themselves before him. MW, Bereshit, in the beginning from last to first. The letter N, Tav, entered first of all. She said, Master of the worlds, may it please you to create the world by me, for I complete your seal. Nax, Emet, truth, and you are called truth registered sign. It is fitting for the King of Truth to begin with the letter of truth and to create the world by me. The Blessed Holy One replied, you are seemly and worthy, but not deserving to initiate creation, since you are destined to be marked on the foreheads of the faithful who fulfilled the Torah from X, Aleph, to N, Tav, and by your mark they will die? Furthermore you are the seal of Nia, Mavat, death, so you do not deserve to serve as the instrument of creation. She immediately departed. The letter W, Sheen, came before him. She said, Master of the worlds, may it please you to create the world by me, for by me you are named WW, Shaddai, and it is fitting to create the world by a holy name. He replied, you are seemly, you are good, and you are true, but since letters of deceit take you as their accomplice, I do not wish to create the world by you. For a lie cannot exist unless 77, Gafresh, take you. So whoever wants to tell a lie will first lay a foundation of truth and then construct the lie. 8 degrees for W, Sheen, is a letter of truth, a true letter of the patriarchs, who were united in it. 1p, Gafresh, are letters that appear on the evil side registered sign in order to survive. They entangle the letter W, Sheen, forming AWP, Gesher, conspiracy. Seeing this, she left his presence. The letter Y, Tzadi, entered. She said to him, Master of the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for N page 7 Tai, Tzadijim, the righteous, are sealed by me, and you, who are called Piety, Tzadik, righteous, are signified by me, as is written, for YHVH, is Piety, Tzadik, loving righteousness. Psalms 11:7. It is fitting to create the world by me, he replied. Why? Tzadi, you are Pty, Tzadik, but you should remain hidden, not so revealed, so as not to provide the world a pretext. How so? She is one, none. Yod, from the name of the Holy Covenant comes and rides on her, is united with her. This is the mystery. When the Blessed Holy One created Adam, he created him with 2 faces. So the 7, Yod, faces backward, like this. Why? They were not turned face to face, like this. Yen, it looked upward like this. Why it looked downward like this. X, the Blessed Holy One said to her, turn back, for I intend to split you and transfigure you face to face, but you will arise elsewhere. She left his presence and departed. The letter 5, Pei, entered. She said to him, Master of the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for I signifies Ap 1 inches, Pergina, the redemption. that you will someday bring to the world, also called Ni, Petit, deliverance. It is fitting to create the world by me, he replied. You are seemly, but you signify hidden transgression, like a serpent striking, then tucking its head into its body, so one who sins bows his head, stretching out his hands. Similarly Ion stands for pi, avon, iniquity. Although she said, I imply moyanava, humility, the Blessed Holy One replied, I will not create the world by you. She left his presence. The letter 0, Samek, entered. She said to him, Master of 3 the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for by me x 3700, Semika, support, exists for those who fall, as is written, mm 710, sunk YHVH supports all who fall. Psalms 145 hours and 14 minutes. He replied, so you are needed where you are, do not move. If you leave, what would happen to the fallen, who depend on you? She immediately left his presence. The letter 1, Nun, entered. She said to him, Master of the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for by me you are called X71, Nora, awesome, in praises, Exodus 15:11. By me, the praise of the righteous is called MXI, Nava, comely, Psalms 33:1. He replied, 1, Nun, return to your place, for because of you 0, Samek, returned to her place, degrees depend on her, she returned immediately, leaving his presence. The letter 1, Mem, entered. She said to him, Master of the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for by me you are called 74 meters, Melech, king. He replied, certainly so, but I will not create the world by you, since the world needs a king. Return to your place, you along with 5 lame Dan, Kaf, for the world should not be without a king. At that moment the letter, Kaf, descended from his throne of glory registered sign and said, Master of the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for I am your 1113, Kavod, glory. When 3, Kaf, descended from the throne of glory, 200,000 worlds trembled, the throne trembled, and all the worlds verged on collapse. The Blessed Holy One said to her, 3, Kaf, what are you doing here? I will not create the world by you. Return to your place, for you imply 755, Kelea, destruction, a decree of destruction. Isaiah 10:23. Return to your throne and stay there. She thereupon left his presence and returned to her place. The letter, Yod, entered. She said to him, Master of the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for I am the beginning of the holy name. It is fitting for you to create the world by me, he replied. It is enough for you to be engraved in me, to be inscribed in me. My desire culminates in you. You should not be uprooted from my name. The letter V, Tet, entered. She said to him, Master of the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for by me you are called WTMANV Tavver. Yasher, good and upright. Psalms 25:8. He replied, I will not create the world by you, for your goodness is concealed and hidden within you, goodness that you have hidden away for those in awe of you. Psalms 31 hours and 20 minutes. As is written, how abundant is your since it is hidden within you. It plays no part in this world that I am about to create, but rather in the world to come. Registered sign. Furthermore, because your goodness is hidden within you, the gates of my temple will sink, as is written, her gates 1 Yav, Tavu, have sunk into the earth. Lamentations 2:9. Further, facing you is N, Het, degrees, and when you join together you spell XVN, Het, sin degrees? So these 2 letters are not inscribed in the holy tribes. Degrees. She immediately left his presence. The letter 1, Zayin, entered. She said to him, Master of the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for by me your children observe the Sabbath, as is written, 1191, Zachar, remember, the Sabbath day, to hallow it, Exodus 20:8. He replied, I will not create the world by you, for you imply war, a sharp sword and a spear for battle, like a none degrees. She immediately left his presence. The letter 1, Vav, enterade. She said to him, Master of the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for I am a letter of your name. Degrees. He replied, 1, Vav, it is enough for you, and 7, he, to be letters of my name, included in the mystery of my name, engraved and carved in my name. I will not create the world by either of you. The letters 1, Dalet, and 1, Gimel, entered and made the same request. He replied to them as well, "It is enough for you to be with each other, since the poor will never cease from the world registered sign and need to be treated kindly." 7. Dalet, is poor. 4. Gimel 911 Gomel, renders, goodness to her registered sign do not separate from one another. It is enough for one of you to sustain the other. The letter 1, Bet, entered. She said to him, "Master of the world, may it please you to create the world by me, for by me you are blessed above and below." The Blessed Holy One replied, "Indeed, by you I will create the world. You will be the beginning of creation." The letter X, Aleph, stood and did not enter. The Blessed Holy One said to her, "X, An, Aleph, Aleph, why do you not enter my presence like all the other letters?" She replied, "Master of the world, because I saw all the letters leaving your presence fruitlessly. What could I do there? Furthermore, look, 3b, you have given this enormous gift to the letter 1, Bet, and it is not fitting for the exalted king to take back a gift he has given to his servant and give it to another." The Blessed Holy One said, X, Aleph, Aleph, although I will create the world with the letter 1, Bet, you will be the first of all the letters. Only through you do I become one. Degrees with you all counting begins and every deed in the world. No union is actualized except by X, Aleph. The Blessed Holy One fashioned high, large letters and low, small letters. So, 3, 1, Bet, Nia NW, Bereshit Bara, XX, X. Elohimet, letters above and letters below. They were all as one, from the upper world and the lower world. Rabbi Yude said, "What is Muksna, Bereshit?" With wisdom. This is the wisdom on which the world stands, through which one enters hidden, high mysteries. Here were engraved 6 vast, supernal dimensions, from which everything emerges, from which issued 6 springs and streams, flowing into the immense ocean. This is now X2 Barashit, created 6, created from here. Who created them? The unmentioned, the hidden unknown. Rabbi Hiaya and Rabbi Yos were walking on the way. As they reached the side of a certain field, Rabbi Hiaya said to Rabbi Yos, "What you have said, MWX 72 Barashit, is certainly true, for there are 6 supernal days in the Torah, not more. The others are concealed registered sign, but in the secrets of creation we Muksra, Bereshit, in the beginning have discovered this, the Holy Hidden One engraved an engraving in the innards of a recess, punctuated by a thrust point. He engraved that engraving, hiding it away, like one who locks up everything under a single key, which locks everything within a single palace. Although everything is hidden away within that palace, the essence of everything lies in that key, which closes and opens. Within that palace lie hidden treasures, one greater than the other. Within that palace stand gates built cryptically, 50 of them, carved into 4 sides. They were 49. One gate has no side. No one knows whether it is above or below. It is shut. Degrees in those gates is one lock and one precise place for inserting the key, marked only by the impress of the key, known only to the key. Concerning this mystery it is written, O degrees T9XX Nia Munia 2, Bereshit Bara Elohim. In the beginning God created MWX1. Bereshit is the key enclosing all, closing and opening. 6 gates are contained in that key that closes and opens when it closes those gates, enclosing them within itself. Then indeed, MW, Bereshit, a revealed word combined with a concealed word. X72 Bara, created, is always concealed, closing, not opening. 29,123 Rabbi Yos said, "Certainly so. I heard the Holy Lamp TM say so, that X72 Bara is a concealed word, closing, not opening. As long as the world was locked within the word X11 Bara, it was not, did not exist, enveloping everything was 17n, Tohu, chaos, degrees, and as long as WN Tohu, reigned, the world was not, did not exist. When did that key open gates? When was it fit to be fruitful, to generate offspring? When Abraham arrived, as is written, these are the generations of heaven and earth ux nana bihibarim, when they were created. Genesis 2, 4, and we have learned, NR 3/2, Avraham, through Abraham registered sign, whereas everything was concealed in the word X72 Bara, now the letters were transposed and rendered fruitful. A pillar emerged, generating offspring, 14 times, ever, organ, holy foundation on which the world stands, when 3x, ever, was inscribed in the word X1 Bara, the supernal concealed one inscribed another inscription for its glorious name. This is 7m5x Zohar, mi Varadella, who created these. Isaiah 40 hours, and 26 minutes. Degrees the holy blessed name 7 Ma, what, was also inscribed out of x72 bar it generated 4 times, ever, inscribing 75 times, Ella, at one end and 72k, ever, at the other holy concealed 175 times, Ella exists, 1x, ever exists. As one was completed, so was the other, in 73 times, ever, it engraved 7, he, in M9x, Ella, Yod, letters were aroused to complete one side and the other. It produced 0 feet, 2 mems, moving one to this side, one to that. The holy name was completed, becoming n degrees 717 times, Elohim, and the name N7M7x Avraham as well. For as one was completed, so was the other, then life was generated and the complete name emerged, unlike before, as is written, these are the generations of heaven and earth Oxnama, Behibarim, when they were created. All remained suspended until the name of Abraham was created. Once that name was completed, the holy name was completed, as the verse concludes, on the day that 0 degrees 77 mim, YHVH Elohim, made earth and heaven Genesis 2, 4, degrees. Rabbi Hiiah prostrated himself on the ground, kissing the dust and weeping. He cried out, dust, dust, how stubborn you are, how impudent, all delights of the eye decay in you. All pillars of light in the world you consume and pulverize. How insolent you are, the holy lamp who has illumined the world, majestic ruler, prince whose merit sustains the world, decays in you. O Rabbi Shimon, radiance of the lamp, radiance of the worlds, you decompose in the dust, yet you subsist and guide the world. Degrees. For a moment he was shocked, and then exclaimed, dust, dust, do not boast, the pillars of the world will not be surrendered to you. Rabbi Shimon has not decayed in you. Still weeping, Rabbi Hiiah arose and walked on together with Rabbi Yos. From that day on, he fasted 40 days to envision Rabbi Shimon registered degrees. He was told, you are not entitled to see him. He wept and fasted another 40 days. In a vision he was shown Rabbi Shimon and his son Rabbi Elazar, studying the word that Rabbi Yos had spoken, degrees with thousands listening. Meanwhile he noticed many huge celestial wings, which Rabbi Shimon and his son Rabbi Elazar mounted, and they soared to the academy of heaven. All those wings waited for them. He saw them returning, their splendor renewed, and they shone more brilliantly than the dazzle of the sun. Rabbi Shimon opened, saying, let Rabbi Hiiah enter and see how the blessed Holy One intends to rejuvenate the faces of the righteous in the time to come. Happy is one who enters here without shame. Happy is one who stands in that world as a sturdy pillar. Rabbi Hiiah saw himself entering. Rabbi Elazar rose together with the other pillars sitting there. Embarrassed, he drew back, then entered and sat at the feet of Rabbi Shimon. A voice issued, lower your eyes, do not raise your head, do not gaze. Lowering his eyes, he saw a light shining in the distance. The voice returned, O high, hidden, concealed ones, open-eyed, roaming the entire world. Gaze and see, O low, sleeping ones, close-eyed, awake degrees. Who among you turns darkness into light, bitter into sweet before arriving here? Degrees. Who among you awaits each day the light that shines when the king visits the dough and is glorified, declared king of all kings of the world? Whoever does not await this each day in that world has no portion here. Registered sign. Meanwhile he noticed many of the companions surrounding him, all those erect pillars, and he saw them being raised to the academy of heaven, some ascending, some descending above them all. He saw the master of wings degrees approaching. When he arrived, he solemnly swore that he had heard from behind the curtain that the king remembers the doe who lies in the dust and visits her every day. At that moment he kicks the 390 firmaments, which all tremble and quake, before him. He sheds tears over this, degrees, and those tears of bubbling fire fall into the vast ocean. From those tears the prince of the ocean emerges, by them he is sustained. And he hallows the name of the Holy King, agreeing to swallow up all the waters of creation and absorb them when all the nations gather against the holy people, degrees, so that the waters will dry up and they will pass through on dry land, degrees. Meanwhile he heard a voice proclaiming, make way, for King Messiah is coming to the academy of Rabbi Shimon. For all the righteous present there are heads of academies, and those academies are designated there. and all members of each academy ascend from the academy here to the academy of heaven. The Messiah visits all those academies, setting his seal on the Torah issuing from the mouths of the rabbis. At that moment the Messiah arrived, adorned by the heads of the academies with celestial crowns. At that moment all the companions rose and Rabbi Shimon rose, his light radiating to the vault of heaven. He said to him, "Registered sign, happy are you, Rabbi, for your Torah ascends in 370 lights, degrees each, and every light refracting into 613 senses. Registered sign, ascending and bathing in rivers of pure balsam. The Blessed Holy One sets his seal on the Torah of your academy, and of the academy of Hezekiah, king of Judah, and of the academy of Ahiah of Shiloh. Registered sign, I have not come to set my seal on what issues from your academy. Rather, the Master of Wings has entered here, for I know he enters no academy but yours." Degrees. Then Rabbi Shimon told him, registered sign, the oath that the Master of Wings had sworn. The Messiah began trembling and cried aloud. The heavens trembled, the vast ocean trembled, Leviathan trembled, and the world verged on overturning. At that moment, he noticed Rabbi Hiah sitting at the feet of Rabbi Shimon. He said, "Who placed a human here, clothed in the garb of that world?" Registered sign. Rabbi Shimon answered, "This is Rabbi Hiah, radiance of the lamp of Torah." The Messiah said, "Let him be gathered in, together with his sons, degrees, so that they become members of your academy." Rabbi Shimon said, "Let him be granted time." 7. Time was granted to him. He emerged trembling, his eyes streaming with tears, quivering. He cried, "Happy is the share of the righteous in that world. Happy is the share of the son of Yohei who has attained this. Of him is written, so that I may endow those who love me with substance and fill their treasuries." Proverbs 8:21. Rabbi Shimon opened, "I have put my words in your mouth." Isaiah 51 hours and 16 minutes. How vital it is for a human being to engage in Torah day and night. For the Blessed Holy One listens to the voice of those who occupy themselves with Torah, and every word innovated in Torah by one engaged in Torah fashions one heaven. MWA. Bereshit. In the beginning, we have learned, the moment a new word of Torah originates from the mouth of a human being, that word ascends and presents herself before the Blessed Holy One. Who lifts that word, kisses her, and adorns her with 70 crowns, engraved and inscribed. But an innovated word of wisdom ascends and settles on the head of piety, tzaddik, righteous one, vitality of the worlds. From there, it flies and soars through 70,000 worlds, ascending to the Ancient of Days. All the words of the Ancient of Days are words of wisdom, conveying supernal, concealed mysteries. When that secret word of wisdom, innovated here, ascends, it joins those words of the Ancient of Days. Along with them, it ascends and descends, entering 18 hidden worlds, which no eye has seen, O God, but you. Isaiah 64:3. Degrees emerging from there, they roam until they arrive, full and complete, presenting themselves before the Ancient of Days. At that moment, the Ancient of Days inhales the aroma of that word, and it pleases him more than anything. Lifting that word, he adorns her with 370,000 crowns. Registered sign. The word flies, ascending and descending, and is transformed into a heaven. So each and every word of wisdom is transformed into a heaven, existing enduringly in the presence of the Ancient of Days. He calls them new heavens, newly created heavens, hidden mysteries of supernal wisdom. As for all other innovated words of Torah, they stand before the Blessed Holy One, then ascend and are transformed into earths of the living. Psalms 116:9. Then they descend, crowning themselves upon one earth, which is renewed and transformed into a new earth through that renewed word of Torah. Concerning this is written, as the new heavens and the new earth that I am making endure before me. Isaiah 66 hours and 22 minutes. The verse does not read I have made, but rather I am making, for he makes them continually out of those innovations and mysteries